Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. As promised yesterday, we're going to, do we have any other motions that we didn't have yesterday?
None came to me.
Does anyone who is part of the meeting, whether you're a committee member or otherwise, have a motion? I would imagine we might get a few once the rest of the counselors are finished with the COVID meeting and join us. So we'll have to be prepared for that, and we'll look for guidance on which ones we deal with when. But we're going to read what we know right now, introduce, and I think we have everybody in the room that is moving anything at this point. And then we will go to questions. Is the OP team on yet, Melody?
There.
Okay, good. All right. So first up is Councillor Hubley. Councillor Hubley, can you introduce your motion, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also have two
Just
motions.
the first one on the new official plan review considerations.
Okay, thank you. So whereas staff recommendation recommends that the city's intensification targets and 15-year land supply required by the provincial policy statement should be reviewed no later than 2026. And whereas during the COVID-19 pandemic, housing prices have had a year-over-year increase that are outside of typical norms for the Ottawa market, which risks making housing unaffordable for many key workers in the local economy, and residential demand and development patterns may have deviated from pre-COVID-19. And whereas the city has adopted an aggressive intensification target that is even higher than that adopted by municipalities in the area surrounding Toronto, whereas intensification is sometimes difficult to accomplish since council regularly hears from stakeholders concerns about the intensity and compatibility of development, and that may mean that the adopted intensification target may be difficult to reach in the time frame contemplated in the growth management framework of the new official plan. Whereas in the last few years, there has been rapid changes to the system of distribution of goods in the cities as a result of the surge in e-commerce business. Therefore, be it resolved that a review consider the following, and there's 4 points. Residential development patterns through intensification and on greenfield lands from 2020 to 2026, and whether that has resulted in any observable change to the market housing demand and affordability. Secondly, industrial development patterns from 2020 to 2026, and an assessment of the uptake of lands for industrial freight and storage and the adequacy of the supply at that 5-year review, particularly in the vicinity of major highways, the 417, the 416, and Highway 7. The potential for these development patterns to continue over the long term, and finally, the adequacy of the residential and industrial land supply as required by the provincial policy statement. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's my motion.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley. And just from my own interest, did you say you have another motion?
Yes, there's another one that I submit through staff to deal with adjacent Highway 400 series interchanges.
We don't have that. So if you would be able to send that to Melody, that would be great.
Okay, thank you.
Very much.
I'll take care of that.
Thank you. And so we're going to go now to Councillor Tierney, who has a motion to introduce. Councillor Tierney.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Whereas in 2017, at the start of the official plan process, City Council directed staff to develop this official plan within the intensification of completing the communities and planning for a new community to accommodate the city's growth in the environment and fiscally sustainable manner. Whereas in May 2020, Council adopted a blended methodology for determining new lands to come into the urban boundary in this OP. Upon updating the scoring methodology currently used based on a set of criteria used to rate parcels of cohesive blocks of land consistent with the provincial policy statement and validating the choice of the new lands against the 5 big moves. Whereas City Council is committed to reconciliation with the local Indigenous communities and recognize the important work of the Algonquins of Ontario as a meaningful opportunity towards achieving this goal. Whereas in February 2018, City Council adopted a formal commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan that includes supporting opportunities to weave Indigenous communities into the socioeconomic fabric of Ottawa in an environmentally sustainable way. Therefore, be resolved that the Joint Planning Committee and Agricultural Rural Affairs Committee recommend to Council approve the following recommendation 5 of the staff report to be amended as follows. Direct staff that the remaining 270 hectares be added to the urban boundary on the lands identified as Terwin, and that the staff focus on the creation of a new community on the Terwin lands, and staff be directed to work with the Algonquins of Ontario between now and June to identify the specific lands in the land use schedule of the new official plan, and be understood that Council's intent in the spirit of a positive and constructive relationship with the Algonquins of Ontario and respect for their objectives of Terwin, that planning process for this new community will be expeditious and collaborative in the planning process. Be it further resolved that the staff be directed to work with the Algonquins of Ontario and their representatives to help secure the funding from the federal and provincial governments to support the Terwin development. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Councillor Tierney. Now we're going to go to co-chair Al Shantiri, who's going to move 2. The first one is the technical amendments, staff corrections, and follow. So perhaps you could do that one first.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Harder. Whereas the report of a new official plan growth management report to lands proposed for residential and industrial urban expansion, details specific land for urban, commercial, and industrial growth, framed by establishment of gold belt in the new OP to direct future urban development away from Ottawa agricultural and natural area. And whereas there have been several administrative errors found in the report since it was published on January 15, 2021. Therefore, be it resolved that the Joint Planning Committee and Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee recommended to Council that the following corrections and additions to be made to the main report and document 1 in the main report on page 2, recommendation 4, replace reference to Appendix A and B with Appendix A. B on page 3, in recommendations 5I, replace reference to inclusion in recommendation 2 with inclusion in recommendation 3. And C on page 3, in recommendation 5I, replace reference to Appendix D with Appendix F. D on page 3 in recommendation 5III, replace reference to Appendix A with Appendix F. Item number 2, in document 2, staff notice a number of corrections and motions to place A, replace O train in all map legends with O train. Okay. B, page 5, correct the South March cost per servicing totals in bracket with score as shown below. C, page 12, correct the Stittsville South cluster score in brackets with a score as shown below. D, page 17 and 18, correct the Barhaven South cluster scores in brackets with the score as shown below. E, page 19, add the property at 3872 Rideau Valley Drive, less than 2 hectare in size, to a cluster B3. F, page 24, correct the Riverside South cluster score in bracket with score as shown below. Page 31, correct the Leitrim cluster scores in bracket with score and added row L-3_1 and L-4 as shown below. Page 33, in the Orleans South cluster map, remove the park and ride symbol at Trim Road. I, page 36 and 37, correct the Orleans South EUC cluster identification code and score in bracket with numbers and score as shown below. I hope you don't ask me to read those scores. They'll take us quite some time.
Thank you for introducing that motion. Would you be able to introduce the motion, please, next on the South March lands?
So that's moved by myself, whereas recommendation 3 of staff report identified a cluster of land shown as South March 175.35 net hectare as a potential area to be identified for urban expansion, dependent on the result of a future analysis and study. And whereas this is a challenging area to develop due to exclusive reliance on March Road, the adjacent country residential subdivision, and proximity to the South March Highland, so much so that council has previously rejected expansions onto this area, only to have been overruled by the Ontario Municipal Board. And whereas the land identified are difficult and expensive to serve due to the bedrock condition and the potential impact on the 5 adjacent country residential subdivision. Whereas further expansion in the area towards Dunrobin and South March Highland might stir speculation land investment for future investment, which is also contrary to the city intent to prevent encroachment on villages. Therefore, be it resolved that Joint Planning and Agricultural Rural Affairs Committee recommend that council approve the South March land cluster identified in recommendation 3 be removed and the land supply 175.35 net hectare be added to the new community option in recommendation 5 of the staff's report as amended.
Thank you very much. Another motion, is Councillor Meehan in the meeting yet?
Let me just check. Yes.
This is it.
Carol Ann, would you introduce your motion, please?
Okay, now can you hear me? Okay, ready? Okay, so this is a motion for Planning Committee. Whereas the past 2 lands south of Rideau Road in Riverside South, as shown in Appendix A, have servicing and infrastructure challenges and create an illogical southern boundary to Riverside South. And whereas City Council has adopted strong principles of intensification and transit-oriented development near light rail transit stations, and City Council has invested $150 million in the Limebank to Bowesville LRT extension, including $32 million for Bowesville Station Park and Ride. And whereas the Bowesville Station will be complete and operational in 2022, and using the proposed lands north of Rideau Road provides Council with the opportunity to design and build a 15-minute demonstration neighborhood within the next few years where high order transit is in place before the first new residents move in. And whereas staff indicates they are supportive of this amendment, only in the context, though, of Riverside South, because of the opportunities created for transit-oriented development and potential increased ridership at Bowesville Station, given that, one, council has consistently promoted intensification development close to transit stations since the adoption of OPA 113 in 2012. And two, section 1.1.3.3 of the provincial policy statement directs planning authorities to identify appropriate locations and promote opportunities for transit supportive development. Three, section 1.1.3.6 of the provincial policy statement directs a preference for new growth adjacent to existing built-up areas to allow for the efficient use of land, infrastructure, and public service facilities. And lastly, because section 1.1.3.8 of the provincial policy statement does allow for the designation of prime agricultural lands, provided the lands are not specialty crop areas and that alternative locations have been evaluated and there are no reasonable alternatives to avoid prime agricultural lands or which use lower agricultural lands. Therefore, be it resolved that the Joint Planning Committee and Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee recommend council approve that the Pass 2 cluster in Riverside South, representing 106.29 net hectares, be removed and an equivalent amount of land be added between the existing Riverside South community and the Pass 1 lands proposed to be added, so that the Riverside South Riverside South can form a logical boundary that is contained north of Rideau Road.
Thank you very much, Councillor Meehan. Now, I have two directions that are Councillor Dudas's, and just before we go to those, I just wanted to say that I think what we're going to do is, because we didn't ask any questions yesterday, and this is very complex subject, obviously, a whole heck of a lot of work has gone into it, and I'm sure you all have questions that are pertaining to the overall document. So this is the way I suggest we proceed. If you want, again, I will remind you that I'm going to try my best, at least if you signed up from the beginning and put your hand up, I will go with members of the joint committee. And then in the order of ward order of those who are not on the joint committee who want to speak. After we get going, though, I'm not going to continue to play around with it. So if you know you want to speak on just questions of the report, sign up now on participants. And then after that, after we go through questions, I think at that point I'll go back to the movers of each of the motions and ask them to say why they're moving it. And then we'll get right into debate of all those motions and directions, okay? So let's go to Councillor Dudas right now for her directions. And then I know we have another motion from Councillor Hubley that he will put on the floor after the directions.
Certainly. Just confirming which one first. Okay. That is not mine. Okay. All right, so this is direction staff that staff be directed to identify the specific gating roadways, public transit ways, and active transportation facilities that would be applicable for the approval of the South Orleans Category 1, as well as the Category 2 Notre Dame des Champs lands, should they be recommended for inclusion within the urban boundary. This identification, which shall be consistent with the lands being designated and available within the meaning of the provincial policy statement, should include the specific mobility and infrastructure upgrades that are required in order for the development of these lands under the new official plan, which will then be evaluated and specified in the update to the Transportation Master Plan. And Melody, are you able to scroll down? I think there's another.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Perfect. That staff working on the Transportation Master Plan are to identify these infrastructure upgrades and expansions in the draft Transportation Master Plan and include them as part of the draft Affordable Network Plan.
Thank you very much. And
I'll just quickly read that second direction and then.
yes, please.
Certainly. That staff be directed to include in the forthcoming official plan report on the Gold Belt specifics on the proposal that provide clarity to residents, planners, developers, investors, etc., with regard to the belt. That the Gold Belt does not affect land use designations and policy in the Gold Belt for the underlying land uses, not impeding the city's flexibility to deploy necessary multimodal transportation infrastructure if deemed necessary by future councils. Clarify that the reference to 2100 is a projection, not a policy timeframe or a sunset clause, and that it is a matter that is reviewed regularly, as is the purpose and effect of the Gold Belt during the legislatively required 10-year reviews of the official plan, and clearly highlight and detail the policies of how the agricultural lands both within and without the proposed belt will be protected.
Thank you. And now we'll go back to Councillor Hubley. Councillor Hubley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and my apologies for the confusion here. Whereas the City of Ottawa is recognized as a strong location in the international marketplace as a growing hub for goods movement facilities, and whereas the prime location for these sites are adjacent to Highway 400 series interchanges, and whereas the majority of the lands adjacent to the Highway 400 series interchanges within the urban area are owned and controlled by the NCC, and whereas staff have recommended the approval of lands identified in Appendix E, as Edward, representing land clusters of 20 net hectares as new rural industrial freight and storage lands, and direct staff to insert this appendix into the draft official plan for technical circulation purposes. And whereas the owners of the subject lands have completed an agricultural impact assessment, which shows the lands have a Lear score well below the 125 threshold, therefore be it resolved that the staff be directed to evaluate the new Lear information and consider the validity of the submission and report to council by June on whether the city can add an additional 34 gross hectares as new rural industrial freight and storage lands at the southwest quadrant of Highway 416 at the Fallowfield interchange as shown in the attached Schedule A. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley. So now, as I said, we're going to go to the room, if you will, for general questions. And I see up on the screen so far, Councillor Moffat, Councillor Leeper, Councillor Giroux. So Councillor Moffat, you're first. Doesn't happen often.
Thanks. I'm going to ask some clarity questions on some of the motions. Is that okay?
I was going to wait for that, but go ahead. You can ask, who are you going to ask it of though? The movers or the staff?
It really depends on who wants to answer, but I just want to get some clarity on some of the motions and their intent and what they actually do.
Okay.
So they got support for the entire conversation.
But we are going to go and introduce them individually. So because it's a lot coming at everybody. And I think we didn't give the opportunity to any of the councillors to say why they were moving it. And
that's fair. I'm just looking for clarity on the actual wording.
Yep.
So on the motion moved by Councillor Tierney about the Taiwan Lands, that's 270 hectares added to the urban boundary. Does that mean that those lands would be added now, and the previous recommendation of further review on a new community in Category 3 would now be off the table, and we would now only be looking at Taiwan as we would actually be permanently adding these lands to the boundary today?
And we're going to go to Mr. Mark for a response on that.
I think Steve Willis.
Or Steve Willis. Steve, you're there? Go ahead.
Barry, it's my interpretation of the intent of Councilor Tierney's motion is that staff asked council to choose among several options of what to do with the remaining 270. My understanding of the motion is that should it be adopted, council is telling staff to focus in on using the 270 on the Taiwan proposal, and that is our focus and our only focus. That's my interpretation.
And if the 270, if further review upon Taiwan says that we can't develop there within the time frame required to meet the 15-year threshold, where does the 270 go? Does it stay there anyways?
The way the motion is worded today, and Mr. Mark can confirm it, and the way the PPS would work is we have to identify it as a as on the land use schedule is an area we have to work on. We'll have to refine exactly where those lands actually are. PPS gives us some flexibility on that, but my interpretation is that is what we would be allocating, would be allocated to that area.
And then you take Councillor El Shantiri's motion, which removes it from South March Highlands and then adds those lands, which is about also 170 hectares. Now we're looking at 440 hectares, if I'm not off on my math, to Taywin. So guaranteed 440 hectares to Taywin by a vote today.
That I would say the same thing I said on the prior recommendation. That is what I believe is the will of the two motions, should council adopt them.
And should the concern in the reports come to fruition, in that the further review upon those lands could yield that those lands are not able to be developed within the time frame and requirement to meet the conditions set out by the province and having the 15-year land supply, would we be at risk of having those 440 hectares in the boundary but not developed, and then having to come back and look at additional 440 hectares elsewhere?
Chairs, we have lands in the urban boundary today in 2020 that have not yet been, 2021, sorry, that have not yet been developed, have been designated in prior official plans. And just because they've not been adopted in the past, they remain within our land budget as available land. There are examples in the south, they're in North Canada, there's lands in the southeast urban community as well. So those lands, my understanding is if they are allocated by council, should council do it, they would be part of the available land. It's just, we would have to continue to prove we have a 15-year land supply. And this is something we would have to assess at the 5-year review, which is recommended part of the report, whether or not they can be delivered within the 5 years.
Right, but if the lands in Taywin cannot be developed in the time frame required to meet the 15-year supply, would there be a risk with these motions that we'd have to come back and add an additional 440 hectares of land?
There would be a risk that additional land would have to be added. We'd have to see at the time, based on the projections, what the 15 years would be and whether or not the full 440. Remember, we're designating land for 25 years. So if there is other land within the system that could still meet our 15 years, and that's a rolling number throughout time, we may be okay. But there is a possibility that if it's not developable within the time frame, that we would have to go find additional land.
Okay, thanks. On the motion from Councillor Hughley and adding lands that are currently designated cultural lands on Moody Drive, I have seen a soils report for 2861 Moody Drive and 2915 Moody Drive. I have yet to see a soils report for 2831 Moody Drive, which has a higher score through our LEAR than the previous two properties that I mentioned. The score in the report that we've created and approved in 2016 is 146. I have not seen a report that calls into question that score. Does staff have a soils quality report on 2831 Moody Drive?
I don't believe we do. Mr. Herwire can correct me, and that's why it's our recommendation that this matter be referred back to staff for further review with whatever available information is, because staff cannot make a determination today on the validity of those assertions, and we would like time to review it.
That's fair. I don't refute that there are lands south of that do not score. Our own LEAR had one property scored at 104. So I know that those lands, they get caught up in the bigger bundle. But in order to get from Fallowfield to those lands, you have to cut through that land, that's parcel that's scored 146. Thanks. And then just one final question. And I might talk later, but I just wanted to get these things out of the way. The Riverside South motion to add prime class, which would be class 2 farmland in consideration of agricultural scores. Of course, class 1 is the best. We don't have a lot of that in Eastern Ontario. So the best lands that we have are generally scored in the 1 to 75, the 165 to 175 range. The lands in this motion north of Rideau Road do score. I believe one of them parcel scores 168. One parcel scores 172. That is equivalent to the land that is south of Hope Side Road between Richmond and Canada, which obviously is land that we'd want to preserve. This land scores the exact same as those lands, which makes it some of the best farmland in the entire Ottawa region and beyond. We voted as a council unanimously to not consider agricultural lands. Does this motion require a reconsideration by council?
I defer to Mr. Mark on the procedural question, chairs.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, in the process for the adoption of the comprehensive official plan, one matter that is yet to come forward, as members of the Joint Committee will be aware, is the public meeting that is to occur in the second quarter of this year. And it is a principle of law that when a statutory public meeting is held, the members of the committee and subsequently the members of council must be capable of being persuaded, i.e. that when someone comes forward and makes submissions to the joint committee, it is possible that the members of the committee and then of council are open to changing their mind. As a result of this, it is my opinion that the standard rules that the city has for revisiting an issue do not properly apply to a case such as this, where a statutory public meeting is going to be subsequently held. And therefore, while council did clearly adopt a motion with respect to not going onto agricultural lands last year, it is in order, in my opinion, for committee and then council to relook at that because of the pending statutory public meeting.
All right, thank you. That's just all the clarity I had for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I noticed we have some new attendees to our meeting. Welcome. Just letting you know that right now we're asking fairly general questions. We had a lot of information yesterday, so if you want to sign up to talk about that. We've introduced motions that we know of. If anyone has motions that they haven't put forward yet that are ready, then please share them with Ms. Duffany so we can all see them, and of course the public that is watching. And then after we finish with the general questions, even though Councillor Moffat did touch on some of the motions, and you're welcome to do so, we will have those motions read out again and introduced as to why each of the movers are moving a particular motion. So now is an opportunity to anything that's been pestering you or you want to know about. So next up is Councillor Leeper, followed by Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Chair. And I suspect I'll be hopping off and on the list today. Some general questions. I think one of the biggest uncertainties that I heard coming out of yesterday was with respect to the gold belt. I am confused about what that is going to be in light of the exchange that Mr. Chown had with us. I'm going to go back to page 43, where Mr. Chown has highlighted that the intent of the inner boundary would be to contain until the end of the century all future urban expansions, and it would prohibit not to be overtaken by future urban expansions. It sounds like it is a meaningful way to protect the lands that are conceptually included within it today. I think the intent of Councillor Dudas's direction that she's seeking, in addition to some of the discussion that we heard yesterday around this simply being a description of the countryside, leaves me wondering, is this a meaningful protection and boundary within the city? What does the gold belt, if we approve the report the way it is today, mean? And what does it mean if Councillor Dudas's motion passes?
So, Madam and Mr. Chair, the gold belt is both a growth management instrument, basically to signal that the city will not expand there. And it is at the same time a continuation of the policy that applies to those lands and that applies especially to the private property owners of those lands as per the designations of the lands today. So there was a mention that Mr. Chown picked up on with respect to possible new severance policies that should not have been there. We'll clean that up. Whatever severance policies apply in the corresponding designations are the policies that will continue to apply under the corresponding designations. But it's basically sending the signal that as the city looks for lands in the future, as it may or may not look for lands in the future, that gold belt will not be part of the lands that are looked at for any expansion between now and the end of the century. That's what it means.
I'm trying to reconcile your use of the word signal versus a meaningful prohibition.
The prohibition comes with the policies that are associated with the designation. So basically it's agricultural resource area, it's natural environment, natural heritage features, And it's all the policies associated with the protection that we give to mineral aggregate designations through our overlays in the new official plan. So those are no-go lands already. The act of putting them in a belt and showing them on a map is basically to make sure that by seeing this, people understand that the city will not be pursuing any eating into those lands as part of eventual future expansion discussions. And that between now and the end of the century, if there's a need to add any further lands to the urban boundary, those lands would not be where we would look for them.
And with respect to leapfrogging the gold belt, does it prohibit in any meaningful way going beyond?
The intent is to prohibit going beyond the gold belt, yes.
So it's the intent, but what is the mechanism by which that is a meaningful prohibition?
I would say that in adopting the recommendation about the gold belt, council would also direct staff to introduce the language that would be needed in order to include all of these provisions.
Okay, thank you. I have some specific questions arising out of the discussions yesterday that I signaled yesterday that I did want to take a closer look at. At O'Keefe Court, it was rejected. And I'm just wondering if you can explain that to me again. It seems like a very natural piece of land with very inexpensive servicing possibilities and good transit as I think it's either a TIFs or a RIFs, but why was it rejected?
Thanks for the question, Madam and Mr. Chair. Yes, they obviously they didn't score well in terms of proximity to existing transit. But I think the larger issue, and I can have Chris Rogers speak to this, is actually servicing. The city has recently done extensive work in that area in terms of water pressure zones, and it would require a very significant change to that recent work, very expensive for the amount of lands that would be added. So primarily there's other issues in terms of, a pump station, but it's the higher cost of servicing those lands that really make them a great challenge.
Okay, and so despite anything that you might have heard yesterday from the proponent, you're comfortable in your recommendation that not be included in the first couple of passes?
That's right. We believe it is properly slotted as Category 2 lands that would be very much more expensive to develop.
Okay. And then the other parcel that I was wondering about was the Claridge lands, I think off Fernbank, where they were talking about a dispute between yourselves and their engineers with respect to the need to submerge the sewage. Can you help me understand what that debate is? Because it sounds like they're just on the cusp.
Yes, it's we did have a lot of back and forth with them. We are adjusting one of the scores, as you may have picked up on in the staff technical motion. It does not change the ranking from Category 2 as currently shown to Category 1. They are close. There's other challenges with those lands in terms of connectivity, wetland impacts, but they would be probably the highest Category 2 lands, but they do not reach Category 1 based on the score.
And so again, you have the same comfort level that they are appropriately categorized?
Yes, we do.
Okay. I have I'll raise it before I forget it because I probably will. The technical amendment that was brought forward suggests replacing O-train on one of the legends with O-train. Is that a mistake?
Very, very minor. It's capitalizing the T in train, and I believe our transportation colleagues were anxious to have that branding or that correction. So,
understood. I've got a bit more prep to do before I start delving into some of the other motions that have been brought forward. So, Chair, I'll move on.
Thank you very much, Councillor Leeper. We'll see you back shortly. Councillor Brockington, followed by Councillor Gower.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Chair. Just to help us, the magic number is 270, correct? That is the difference between the number of hectares City Council agreed to expand the urban boundary versus what is actually being recommended today. That's the difference. Is that 270?
Yes, that currently is the difference or the missing land in terms of the recommendations today, 270 hectares.
So we have motions before us that exceed 270. So just from a procedural point of view, I want to get the procedure questions out, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, and to staff. We are not permitted to recommend or approve motions that would increase the urban boundary by more than what council agreed in May of 2020. Is that correct?
Chairs, if I may, on this one. So the motions before you, the Councillor Tierney motion says, of the staff options put in front of you, pick the Taywin as the option to focus in for the 270. The El Shantiri motion says, cancel out any expansion in South March and take the land that was allocated to that and put it to Taywin as well.
Okay.
The Meehan motion says take land that was recommended south of River Road and Riverside South out and take that land and put it adjacent to Bowesville Station. So if all those motions are adopted, the effect is that we will still be within the 1281 that council adopted last year, and we are not exceeding it. Should council vary from that, delete, just like a budget process, then we're into problems, and we would have to find other sources for that.
Is there not, though, a motion by Councillor Hubley around the 416 to add?
So that land is the industrial freight and storage, where there is no PPS limitation, and staff's recommended amount of industrial freight and storage, Mr. Fu can get on the line to correct me. We recommended well below the amount that we recommended. We said to council, we gave council a range that we would come in last year, and we're well below that number. So I believe we are still within the number. And staff have not, as I said, have not indicated their support or lack of support for that application. We have new information. We want a chance to review it. But I believe that should we recommend it, it would still be within the range we had originally brought to council. And can you please correct me if I'm not correct about that?
Chair, Willis is correct. We are within the range that we had.
What does it say?
Back in May.
Okay, Mr. Chair, so again, just so we're all clear, hypothetically speaking, if all motions presented today pass, we would still be respecting the direction or the decision that City Council made in 2020.
Chairs, the councillor is correct. If all the motions pass, we would be within what council approved last year.
Okay, so obviously the next little while today, we have to debate the merits of the motions. Like Councillor Leeper, I've got some really precise questions. I'm going to yield the floor to my colleagues at this time. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Brockington, that's fine. Whenever you want, hop back on. From the joint committee, we have Councillor Gower, Councillor Hubley, Councillor Kitts. If anyone outside of the joint committee wants to pop on, now would be a good time. Councillor Gower.
Thank you, Chair. So Councillor Leeper asked about one specific thing that came up yesterday around the Claridge lands, the Fernbank lands west of Stittsville. So thank you, Councillor Leeper. We had a number of representatives from Kavanaugh, and I think Ms. Millens brought it up as well. There was an objection to inclusion of estate lots, I believe, within the Gold Belt. Could staff just address that, why they felt the inclusion of those lands was appropriate within the Gold Belt?
Madam Chair, the approvals that have been granted in the past remain. The Gold Belt would not take them away. So if there is country lot subdivisions that were draft approved and registered prior to the moratorium, those approvals remain in place and the Gold Belt changes nothing to them.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I probably could have asked this when we were talking specifically about the employment lands and so on, but the Carp Road Corridor BIA brought up a concern about economic development strategy to support the anticipated growth for freight and industrial. Is that going to be included in the official plan, or is that a separate process, a separate economic development process?
Thanks for the question. Yes, certainly there are provisions in the draft official plan that would allow, consideration for that corridor in the long term to be serviced if it's feasible from an engineering perspective and is financially feasible. So that opportunity exists. The lands we're adding in proximity at the 417 interchange in Carp Road will certainly do nothing but potentially help them in that regard. And in terms of the economic development piece, we have a very open dialogue with the BIA. We support them, we fund them. I think that would be a future initiative in terms of our rural economic development strategy that we'd be happy to explore further. So that would be less of a draft official plan matter and more of an economic development initiative.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit here, I want to ask the same question to staff that I asked to the delegation from Taiwan, which is I'm looking for your advice or your perspective on how our planning committee and council should consider matters of reconciliation and Indigenous land use or land rights rather in the overall planning process. How does that fit in? Very open-ended question.
Chairs, we're in new territory right now on this issue, and it's true across much of the country. As Indigenous groups start taking their ownership in land and looking for economic development opportunities, they are approaching municipalities such as Vancouver, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, and others for the opportunity to do that within the planning frameworks, and they're looking for the opportunity to take some role in the planning of their land. I don't think staff can tell council how to weigh this. Council has adopted a motion related to reconciliation, and we are doing more work as an organization to understand how this gets woven into what we do, but it's very early days. I don't think staff from our department are in a position to answer your question, Councillor, other than we acknowledge that it's a significant consideration.
Okay, thank you. I have some more questions about the motions, but I'll stop there and maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later once we've all had some more time to digest them. Thank you, Chair.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Councillor Hughley, then Councillor Kitts, and then Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. A question to you first before I start. I have a series of questions to do with the overall strategy and everything. Do you want those questions now, or will we hold them to the later meeting and just deal with issues today around the map, if you will, or the boundary piece?
Well, if they're general questions about, the whole process, et cetera, you should speak to them now. If they're specific to a specific motion, then it probably is easier if we tie it in when we go back to the motions. But really, I think that part of today is going to be people coming back and forth on, off again as their interest is piqued or they think of another question. So I think we're pretty flexible for that. So I turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Then what I'll do first is clarify some items to address the questions on my two motions. One, the one to do with the 416 interchange, the freight lands there. I fully agree with Councillor Moffat that we need to get that second report to clarify before we go forward. And that's why I'm not doing the motion to bring that land in right now. That addresses the concerns that staff have raised too. But we also have to recognize that people are going through the process that we have set out to have their lands evaluated and to make sure that their scoring was properly done and everything. Because this is such a huge undertaking, there's always opportunity for clarifications to correct some of the numbers provided. So that's the purpose of both of the directions, is to make sure that we don't have to go through the whole judicial process to fix minor things that staff are going to probably fix anyway. For example, there's been a couple of files where they've already changed the scoring on those files, recognizing new information. And so that's the purpose of those two motions, for my colleagues to know what we're trying to address here.
Chair,
The,
Chair,
yep.
just on Councilor Hughley's point, or just point of personal privilege, can we get the motions emailed to us directly that were tabled? Do we have all of those? I saw them on the screen, but I'd love to refer back.
I believe Ms. Stephanie said she was emailing them to everyone.
I emailed them to the members and put them in the shared drive, but I can send them out to all members of council now.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Will do.
Okay, so that addresses those concerns. That basically what I'm trying to do here by those two motions. Some of my questions on the policy piece of this and what we're using for a framework to do it. I'd like to get additional information from staff. For example, the page 27 reference to suburban transit. I'd like clarification whether our current system can support more than 10% electric vehicles in the suburbs or even downtown for that matter, and how many home chargers our current system can support, and who will pay for the upgrades to that system if we decide to go to only electric vehicles on our streets. So I realize that's going to take some studying, but before we put it into a policy and say this is what we're going to do, I'm hopeful that staff have done some research on that and can explain it. Go ahead.
Chair, on that very specific issue, since it's, I think, less tied to the decision today and more tied to the draft official plan policies, may I recommend that staff take that issue offline, get the information for the council, and we'll reply after today's meeting. Since I don't believe the answer to that question affects the decisions today, unless the councillor disagrees with me.
No, Mr. Wills, that's why I asked the question at the start, because I've shared these questions with staff. My concern is the intensification target. If we cannot deliver what we set, then it just becomes a useless target. And I really need a lot more detail on how we're going to do that in existing neighborhoods, which is basically what intensification is. There's things that go beyond planning when we start talking about converting the whole system to vehicles and everything, electric vehicles and changing the transit standards and all that as part of a planning document versus being done at the Transit Commission. So I'm more than happy to take your suggestion and wait as long as we get it done before we approve the final plan later this year. Okay, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hughley. Next, we have Councillor Kitts.
Thank you, Chair. I have a lot of questions, so feel free to cut me off if you need to, and I can get back on the list later. I'm curious to learn more about the gating criteria that the Category 1 and 2 lands would be subject to. In our current system, that growth pays for growth by way of development charges, we see a built-in delay in seeing infrastructure upgrades. And that's what we're currently battling with the South Orleans lands that are within the current urban boundary. So I think it's causing cynicism that the gating criteria will have any real effect in rectifying our current and future infrastructure challenges. So my question is, what is your plan for ensuring that there's funding available to ensure that the criteria is realized in advance of putting shovels in the ground?
So, Chair, is that we work in I hate to say it, an imperfect system where the legislation the province has set for us that collects development charges. There is a built-in lag. The councillor uses exactly the right term to describe what happens is we identify something in a plan. In order to get the money to actually build it, we actually have to have units under construction that contribute their development charges, which contribute to the infrastructure, and there's a built-in lag in and around the city. And the city is also, in our last development charges bylaw, we had to update our cost projections and our estimates for both built rate and the costs of projects, and we're always playing a game of catch-up on this. So really what we're recommending in the report is that we tie improvements that will be evaluated in the transportation master plan, particularly, They inform the secondary plans about what upgrades should happen in what order, and that will also feed into the development charges bylaw. I don't know that I can guarantee we'll ever be in a fiscally easy situation with these infrastructure upgrades because, as I said, the legislation that governs this sets a lag in it. But we certainly understand the concerns that have been particularly in the southeast portion of the city and the council board. And that's why we flagged that as an issue in our evaluation. And you'll see that it's actually part of the staff report that we acknowledge it.
Okay, so it leads to my next question, which is when scoring transportation for these South Orleans parcels, I'm wondering if the fact that one of the biggest barriers to improving the transportation infrastructure in this area is that we're in a complete stalemate with the NCC over extending Brian Coburn and the BRT route that would run in parallel to it. So was this taken into consideration in the scoring? Because while I can appreciate that there are other parts of the city where infrastructure updates are required in advance of future growth, I think that the stalemate situation that South Orleans is battling with is unique. And I'd like some clarity as to whether that had any impact on the scoring of those lands.
Thank you for the question. The scoring in terms of transportation is based on either existing or planned transit. So the short answer is no, it would not impact that scoring because it is a planned transit network. But it does lead into the need for, that gating or those preconditions before development can happen.
Okay. Do you have any sense, and I know that this is probably not a perfect question, but do you have any sense of the timeline as to when we would see the Category 1 and 2 lands, or specifically the Category 1 lands, begin to get developed, since there is still undeveloped land within the current urban boundary?
Councillor, the city doesn't actually have a lot of control over the pace at which proponents bring forward their detailed plans to a subdivision stage. We have lands that were approved in 2013 that were advanced very rapidly. We had lands that, for example, in the Fernbank area where they had all the approvals in place and were able to proceed to subdivision level, and they didn't because of economic conditions. So it depends a lot on economic cycles, but there is probably a lag of several years. Any of these lands could come in because we have to do master servicing work, we have to do master transportation work, we have to deal with the area specific development charges for stormwater works, we have to deal with a number of other factors including the community design plans. So anything that's approved today is unlikely to come in within 5 years. And much of what we're going to be relying on right now for the 15-year land supply stuff that was approved in the prior round. So we're 5 to 10 years is a bet at this stage. I can't be more precise than that.
Okay, thank you. I'll shift now to, obviously I've got lots of concerns about the South Orleans lands, but I'll switch areas. So for clarification for some rural residents that have reached out to say that they believe that their land is currently zoned agricultural, but is not conducive to quality farming, can you just clarify that the Gold Belt does not impede landowners from initiating the process of reassessing their land for a possible rezoning out of the ag resource area?
Thank you for the question. No, there is a process under the Planning Act in terms of official plan amendment applications, and we've seen those before. There's nothing that would prevent a landowner from going through that process and applying.
Okay, that was my understanding, but I just wanted everyone listening to get the same clarification. I'm almost through my questions here. So I'm also wondering if a review of expanding the boundaries of smaller rural villages, namely VARs, was explored in this review.
We're actually not looking at village expansions as part of this urban boundary discussion. There is a process set forward in the draft official plan that contemplates and sets out how those village expansions can occur. So we're certainly not excluding them, but we're not considering as part of this this process at this time.
So it could be explored again at a future date.
Yes, following the official plan, there's a number of villages where we know, that will be pursued following this new official plan. Yes.
Okay. And then my last question for now, there's the parcel in Orleans North that is north of Old Montreal Road. There is existing estate lots in that area. So is it in your view that these existing lots will receive municipal servicing as part of this expansion?
They may have the ability to connect to municipal servicing if it's, proximate to their, their residences. Quite often we see that there's cost sharing arrangements or local improvement opportunities for those residents. So there would be, I would categorize it as an opportunity to connect.
Okay. And would the opportunity preclude that these residents would move into an urban tax rate? Like they would have to be given the opportunity to connect to municipal services before they would get taxed at an urban rate? Because it's my understanding they're currently taxed at a rural rate.
Steve, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, Councillor, you're raising a very complicated question that there's no easy answer to. So, a lot of it has to do with the services that are available. This issue there are effectively rural estate subdivisions that were swallowed up with urbanization over the years. I mean, there's some unusual ones. Councillor Aglai has an area in his ward that was once a rural estate subdivision that's now part of the urban area. There are Chair Harder has one in her area, and they all have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And it's a complicated question about what services they get and what taxes they pay. And I think it will, if you don't mind, I'll take this offline. Mr. Mark and I will come talk to you about what that future might mean, what the various choices and routes would be for that.
Okay, no, that's fine. We can take that off. I have some more questions about that particular parcel, but again, I think that they can be taken offline. So thank you very much, Chair. Those are my questions for now.
Thank you, Councillor Kitts. And next speaker is Councillor Menard. So any councillor need to go back, they can just put their hands up. And now we're just going to go in order who comes first. Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have several questions as well. The first one is around finances. Staff have laid out a fairly robust process presented for determining the costs of potential new lands to be included. That's the 270 hectares and where those might come from, and the cost that those could produce over the years is determined, that we want to see those produced. And staff have laid out a process to do that. We have costs identified as high, very high estimates in some of the water, wastewater infrastructure for some of the lands that are being 270 hectares, for example. And so my question to staff is, how can the public be provided and councillor be provided more information about the cost of expansion in the other proposed areas, the current 1,000 new hectares that are being proposed for Pass 1 and Pass 2? How can the public and councillors receive those estimates?
So chairs, in the background information that we have done, both transportation and servicing staff have looked at every parcel land as part of their scoring about ease to which they can be serviced. So there is information that staff has available. I'll talk to Mr. Herwire and find out how we can make that. It is inherent in the scoring that if things were extremely expensive, they scored lower in this. Mr. Rogers, Chris Rogers' team looked at all kinds of servicing related issues. We got outside expertise on geotechnical conditions in many areas, and as the transportation staff know well based on the capacity and system, proximity to the network and the like. So this is there. We'll go back because I understand your concern. We'll figure out a way to make that information available.
Okay, thank you for that. And I know Edmonton had done a study on this previously, and the sort of ongoing public costs over 50 years were 10.6 billion. There were some differences. They were adding a similar amount of people. Actually, that was half. That was 195,000. We're talking about 400,000. That was 195,000 people being added to their city. Obviously different neighborhoods, but there's some similarities between Edmonton and Ottawa. do you see similarities in that report that was produced, and can Ottawa receive a similar report with actual dollar figures of what this cost would be versus, say, intensification at a higher number?
So, Councillor, we've gone through that Edmonton report in quite a bit of detail, and it was prepared by the same consultant who did Ottawa's report in 2013 using the same methodology. And as I explained in the memo to Council last year, we decided that it wasn't good value for dollar to replicate the 2013 report to get the exact same information that we would have got last time, which is that intensification is always the most cost-effective way of addressing it, and that there is a gradation, although we acknowledge that there are some differences in this, and that's in my memo from last year. We talked about all that. If Council were to direct us to get a further study, we could. We'd have to find a funding source for that because that's not part of the official plan budget, and we also have a responsibility to meet the timelines Council's established. The detailed information the Council is looking for will really come out in the Transportation Master Plan and the Infrastructure Master Plan when we actually are designing the exact changes and doing much more detailed cost estimates at that stage. So anything we do right now would be very high level, but those detailed master plans that come forward will have much more information, and that is part of the process.
Okay, that's helpful. I think it would be great to get a rough estimate of how many billions this is going to cost Ottawa over the next several decades, so that people know what the decision we're making has huge cost implications, and having an actual dollar figure on it would be, as an estimate, would be very helpful. I'll move on to the intensification targets. In the report, staff indicate that we may be in a position where intensification targets that we have set could be exceeded. We say that on page 52 of the report, that the targets that could be met or exceeded, and the land supply could be adequate to 2046 or more. And so if we are exceeding our targets early on, will staff consider amendments to the amount of land needed or supposedly needed to meet the end target? What will you do if we're seeing higher than anticipated intensification targets or numbers?
Madam Chair, that would be the subject of the review that we would undertake in 2026. We would still be under the approved growth management strategy. So obviously, if the intensification target is going better than anticipated, it means that the land supply would last theoretically longer, but council can direct at that time any number of different things. Typically, lands are not removed from an urban boundary once they are placed into the urban boundary, but obviously it would redo the math on how long the land amount would last.
Okay, that's helpful. The 270 hectares then could be considered, I guess, at that time, if we are in advance of our targets with that split. So appreciate that. On the Gold Belt, there are several donut holes that we see. There's a significant amount of space between the Gold Belt and the Green Belt. I think I heard Councillor Moffat say about 8,000 hectares there. What is the policy tool that would actually help make sure the Gold Belt is sustained over time? I've heard the conversation with Councillor Leeper and others, but what policy tool would actually make this a reality rather than sort of the assurances we're getting? Is there a policy tool that could be used and developed?
There is no policy tool at this time that we're recommending. This would be a direction that council would provide to staff, and we would come back with that as part of the official plan in June for the statutory public meetings.
Can you say that last part again? You'd come back in June with which? Sorry, Mr. McGill, I missed that.
If there are policies that council directs us to introduce to associate with the Gold Belt as a growth management tool for the official plan, then we would come back with that when we present the next version of the OP.
Okay, thank you for that. My next question is around climate change and the implications for our city with some of these lands. Are there differences in the land parcels being selected for climate change? And I ask this both with either meeting our targets that we have in our climate change master plan or not. If we don't meet those targets, they're very ambitious. If we're not meeting them, are there differences between the land parcels that we have out there for our climate change initiatives and our goals? If staff could elaborate on that.
The designation of land in and of itself does not affect emissions. What affects emissions is how we are heating and cooling buildings and how the transportation fleet moves around. So those would be the main ways through which emissions would be reduced to meet the council targets. Land in and of itself does not contribute emissions.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's the actions after you build that land. So people having to say build a road through the green belt, or to drive into their job if it happens to be in the core, versus where they are right now. So just concerned about that as an implication for some of these. We mentioned that this is likely going to be the last major addition in terms of urban boundary expansion in document 1. We say that. So the exact wording I'm trying to find here, but it's proposed to be the last major addition in terms of our greenfield expansion. Can you just clarify if that is the intent, that this urban boundary expansion we've got in front of us is going to be the last large big expansion that we anticipate in our city?
Council chairs, if I may take that, we're in a process of very substantial change in our approach. I mean, Ottawa's picked the most aggressive intensification target of all the major cities. I mean, the example that the council raised about Edmonton evaluated higher numbers and only went with 50%. Hamilton's evaluated higher numbers and only went with 50%. The province used to mandate the Greater Toronto Area having 60%, and they lowered it to 50% because the municipalities in and around Toronto said it was unachievable. So Ottawa has set the highest of major cities in Canada intensification target at 60%. We need a wholesale change in the product that building industry is offering in Ottawa to achieve that, and we need a wholesale change in the demand for units that are different than single family housing or what you find in the suburban communities. We need people to change what they want as well. So everything depends on both those things happening. It depends on a change in demand and a change in the supply that's available. And if we are more successful over time, that'd be wonderful. We can accomplish that, but it depends on a lot of change happening. And just to give you some numbers to ground you in this, at 60% intensification, we need 24% more built dwelling units inside what's already built today in the full urban area of the city. So we need to fit 24% more housing units in every neighborhood in the city, basically, or in some distributed manner in order to accomplish 60%. So I'm a big believer in lofty, ambitious goals, but this is very ambitious. If we exceed it, that'll be, people who are in this role down the road, future councils will have the benefit of that decision. But we have to monitor it very carefully because it is extremely ambitious.
Okay, thank you for that. There is a mention of employment lands in here. Recommendation 10 calls for the conversion of lands in an industrial area in the Richmond secondary plan to non-industrial. I understand there's area specific policy for the area that would be included. I'm just on a broader sense, how often do approved industrial or employment lands get changed back over to residential?
Chairs, if I may, and Royce will back me up on this. The provincial policy statement makes it extremely difficult to make that change, and it can only occur during a comprehensive review. So it must occur now. It can't occur as an application like you would see an official plan amendment for a new height in your ward, for example, the council ward. It's not the same. It only can happen when municipalities do comprehensive reviews, and the bar is extremely high. And the province wants to protect the employment lands in the province for jobs and activity and what we need. And they're hard to replicate once we lose them. But that being said, we acknowledge in this comprehensive review, there are a number of previously designated employment lands that are not particularly suitable, and they make really good opportunities for infill and replacement and meeting our housing need, which does lower the demand for additional points. And Royce, you looked at these, chairs, Royce looked at these parcels specifically. I'd like to add what I responded.
Okay, that's your time right now, Councillor Menard. So I know you're gonna, you know the routine here. I don't have to tell you. Councillor Gower, Councillor Leeper, Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. I guess I wanted to dig in on Councillor Tierney's motion on the Taiwan Lands. I have a friendly amendment, and I just want to tell you why I wanted to introduce this. I think the Taiwan Lands is a really compelling proposal, and we heard a lot about that yesterday. And I think I said to the delegation, it's not proven. It's compelling, but it's not proven. And just going through some of the notes from staff and some of my notes from the meetings, there's a lot of challenges, a lot of risk with that particular piece of land. The cost for servicing it is high. It's on sensitive clay. There's geotechnical risk. There's earthquake risk, long-term settlement risk. Obviously, there's some big costs involved in serving it with rapid transit. There's unclassified wetland nearby. There's a lot of risk around it. And I wanted to introduce a friendly amendment to Councillor Tierney. I just want to make sure that if we're approaching this piece of land the way that I'm reading the motion, that we're not giving carte blanche to develop without consideration of the cost to our municipality. So I'll need to find it in my many emails coming in here today, but it's a very simple motion that reads, a very simple friendly amendment.
Do you want me to read it out, Glenn? I have it in front of me right here.
I've got it now, thanks, Tim. Be it further resolved that in the draft official plan to be presented to council in 2021, staff shall recommend necessary policies and technical requirements that are required before council approves a secondary plan for the Taiwan development. I appreciate that in the motion, there's already a mention of provincial and federal funding, but I just want to make sure that we have some very clear conditions in place within the official plan, policy and otherwise, so that we're not putting the cart before the horse, so that we're not giving carte blanche to infrastructure spending without having a source on how to actually achieve that.
I accept that as a friendly, Madam Chair. If you can please include that within my motion.
That's great. So Melody, you have all that you need on that? Okay, so somebody type it up and send it to Melody, please. That would be you, Councillor Gower.
I'll forward that to Melody.
Do you have any other questions this round?
I don't think so. I think there'll be some more discussion as we go. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Perfect. We'll go back to Councillor Leeper now.
Thanks, Chair. A high-level question for staff that I think we need to understand. I mean, I've come into this process. It's my first urban boundary expansion, and while I opposed an expansion of the urban boundary, but today we're being asked to add parcels. That is the question that is before us. And in general, if we are going to have an urban boundary expansion, I tend to accept the conventional wisdom that is best accomplished by having parcels of land added that are contiguous to the current area, that are as close to the core area as possible in order to minimize the number of kilometers that are being driven. And I've been trusting that staff have undertaken a good, thorough analysis of the various parcels that they've been asked to add to minimize and mitigate those impacts of expansion, both for the taxpayer and with respect to climate change. The rigor is important to me. I like the mechanistic approach that staff have taken to this issue. We're being asked today to consider some motions that move beyond the rigor that staff have applied to certainly the Pass 1, Pass 2 lands. Is this, in fact, are we at liberty to do whatever we want? Are there routes for challenges based on not sticking to our methodology that exist for the developers? Those who feel that their parcels have been passed over inappropriately based on the approach that council has agreed to, are there approaches that would see them successfully challenge that at whatever level of government or court?
Mr. Chair, I will start off, and then the General Manager may wish to add something.
Thank you.
Of course, as members of the Joint Committee are well aware, the official plan is subject to the approval by the minister. And therefore, any person is free to make submissions to the minister after the plan has been approved to seek to have modifications made by the minister. So that is one possible avenue. There is no appeal to local planning appeal tribunal. That has been removed. There is always a prospect of a challenge to the courts. One cannot remove that possibility. If someone were making a challenge, in my opinion, it would have to be on the basis of inconsistency with the provincial policy statement. We did approach the Ministry of Municipal Affairs to see if such a challenge had ever been made where the minister is approving an official plan. And to date, no such challenge has been made, but there is a prospect of that being done. Having said all that, in my opinion, it's going to be a much higher bar for a successful challenge to be made to the courts than has traditionally been the case in front of local planning appeal tribunal.
To what extent does quantitative analysis of the options before us serve as a proxy for adherence to the provincial policy statement? If we've designed that methodology to best achieve the outcomes that we want from the provincial policy statement.
So chairs, I'm going to answer this. I'm sure Mr. Mark can intelligently supplement what I have to say. So first of all, I think it's fair to say, some councils have asked me this question in the past. I mean, the expansion is both an art and a science. It's a science particularly about where not to build. So we have experts on staff like Stowe and others who easily tell you where environmentally lands which not candidates goes out and they're not considerations. We have, there's more of an art about what comes in.
Mr. Willis?
Yes.
I don't know if everybody just heard you going, wah, but could you just repeat the last minute, please?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Chair. Can you hear me more clearly if I pull in closer here?
Yes, but it was breaking up, so try it again.
That's right. So I think I have explained to a couple of councillors that there's an art and a science involved with making an urban boundary expansion decision. The science is where not to build. And we have experts on staff like Mr. Stowe who can tell you where there's environmentally sensitive land that should not be candidates for growth. We take that very seriously. That's part of our evaluation. Then it becomes more of a which is the best lands to bring in which order. And the numerical scoring system is an attempt to take some of the thoughts in the provincial policy statement, the 5 big moves which council has adopted in terms of its goals, and giving a scoring system. And the city of Ottawa has used a scoring system since amalgamation to try to referee the process of who comes in. And it has worked in the past for the most part in defense and in appeals previously on the Ontario Municipal Board, but not entirely. So we still always have to link things back to the core of consistency with the provincial policy statement. And as Mr. Mark said, that ultimately is the test. And council has a lot of latitude to make whichever decision it chooses, provided that decision is consistent with the provincial policy statement.
And you know obviously where I'm going with this. We're being asked to take Pass 1 lands out in South March and to add those to the Category 3 new community option. And those Pass 1 lands are fairly easily serviced. They are contiguous to the existing urban boundary, which minimizes some of the distances that people need to travel, fewer kilometers per vehicle traveled. There's a really clear congruence between the South March lands and the provincial policy statement that may not be there with the Taiwan lands. In Riverside South, I'm really struggling to reconcile replacing the Cat 2 lands with prime agricultural land. The scoring is the council direction that we avoid agricultural land strikes me as being in congruence with the provincial policy statement. Swapping the lands out does not inspire me that it's a particularly rigorous decision. And I'm just trying to understand how bulletproof we are at the courts if we are challenged on those moves.
Who's going to take the question?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, I'll start off and then the general manager may wish to add. Clearly, there has to be a rationale. Staff have provided recommendations to you based on consistency with provincial policy statement, based on the directions that council gave last year. And to the extent that one is going to change from that, there needs to be a rationale behind it. If there is a solid rationale behind it, I will never promise chairs that we are bulletproof in front of the courts. That would be foolhardy, but we would stand a good chance of success in front of the courts.
Okay. I'm going to yield the floor for the moment, Chair. I'll be back in a bit.
I'm sure you will. And I would say now, after a long wait, Councillor McKenney, your turn, and followed by Councillor Menard. And I don't see any others up here. Before you start, Councillor McKenney, I don't see any other hands here. So on the general questions, before we go to motions, if you have more, so Councillor Leeper, that might be you, for example, you want to hop back on, or whomever, now would be a really good time. And if anyone has any motions in hand at this point, please send them over to Melody. Thank you. Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. I may come back to some of my questions on motions, but I think the questions I have now probably will satisfy some of the things some of the answers I'm looking for. I'm just struck by the fact that yesterday we had several landowners come to committee arguing that, their land should have, been above that threshold, that 14-point threshold. And when I think about today, the Taiwan Lands, I wonder if staff can tell me what their scoring was, like what their servicing scores were, and how would we compare that to some of the arguments that were made in front of us yesterday.
Madam Mr. Chair, in terms of a numerical score, any category 3 lands would score very low, just based on the nature of their location. It's all based on proximity to existing services, existing infrastructure, and planned or existing transit. So in terms of that numerical score, the category 3 lands would score the lowest.
Do you have the servicing scores for the Taiwan Lands? Do we know what they are? The overall?
I'm sure we could pull them out. The issue with that area is there's hundreds of different land parcels, and the parcels are, multiple, but we could give you a range, but they would be 0 or very low.
Okay. Is it possible to get those before, within the next day or two, just so that we have those as we're contemplating this?
We're going to just, I think I didn't mention this today, but February 10th is the council date.
Yeah.
So that gives staff time.
So Councillor, that proposal would have got no points for servicing because it is not adjacent to an existing pipe. So I can confirm that right now. So it would have had no points in that area.
Okay, so there's no water or wastewater capacity for those lands?
No, just let's with respect, Council, I want to parse the words. Capacity exists in the entire system to service the growth projected in the official plan. It's the availability of a pipe to connect to. That's the problem.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Of the Taiwan Lands, I know that a lot of it is encumbered by natural heritage features. Does staff know, and can you tell us how much of the land that's not encumbered by these natural heritage features are actually Algonquin-owned lands?
Yes, we actually have a slide we could bring up that shows the the lands that are owned by the Algonquins, and I'll just get the number for Melody of the slide. It's at the back of the deck, Melody, from yesterday's presentation.
Actually, I believe Andy is sharing from your group.
Ah, okay. Just bear with us for a moment.
Chair, do you want me to go on with another question while they're looking for that?
Yes, why don't you do that?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for the suggestion.
Yeah, thanks. And other penalties, what were some of the other penalties that brought down the score for the Taiwan Lands? I understand it's poor soil conditions. So I just want to understand how poor those soil conditions are, and given the quality, the clay-based soils, how can we know that affordable construction can happen that will allow for density, anything over 4 stories, if we have such poor soil?
So chairs, older geotechnical reports, and they go back many, many years, suggest the soil conditions in that area are poor. They are marine clays, and there would have been penalties applied in the scoring for there being marine clays. With the group behind the Taiwan proposal is submitting new geotechnical information to us, and I think it's a vast area. There will be variability within it. We have marine clays in much of the southeast area. So in Councillor Kitt's ward, for example, there are marine clay soils in that area as well. So it is an area we need to study more fully. We need more information. We are relying on older information, and we've just received, as said, relatively new information. We need more time to understand that. But it does add to construction costs. It certainly does. And that's what staff have flagged in the background document to the report.
But you today, presumably, maybe Thursday, and us in 2 weeks, are being asked to make a decision on a motion that would, add 270 hectares plus the Pass 1 Category 1 lands into this. So with new geotech information, to build on. It's very expensive to build anything over 4 stories. So do we have the information that we need as councillors to make this decision today and then in 2 weeks?
Councillors, staff have presented you the information we have, and the new information will refine that. I think staff, way we've scored this and presented it, represents historic information, and it does represent probably the worst case scenario understanding. The proponents feel that the information we've relied on is overly pessimistic, and they want to make a case to us that it's better than the old information we've been relying on. This area is buildable. We are building in Cumberland area on marine clay soils. There are marine clay soils in other parts of the city as well. But staff are not denying that there are additional construction costs, both in the building of infrastructure, which would presumably be allocated to the development costs or the development charges, and they'll have higher costs when they're building their buildings in that area. So we're not denying that, chairs. It is a higher cost than on other areas, but Ottawa we've built on all of the easy land in Ottawa, very much so. As we get further and further out, we're encountering marine clays in virtually every direction.
Thanks. I think, with respect, I'm not sure that you answered my question. So back in the 70s, when the region was picking lands outside the urban boundary at the time, developing Canada, Barrhaven, Orleans, this land was not chosen, and that report shows very clearly why it wasn't chosen. And it was that the clay, the poor soil, was key to that. So I guess my question is, do we as council, do we as councilors have the information we need today and in 2 weeks from now to make a decision based on fact in terms, like, sure, I'm sure that if I own land, I tell you the clay was, the soil was better too, and that I'll come armed with better information, but that doesn't help us today, and that doesn't help us in 2 weeks from now when we have to make a decision. So I'm asking if you as head of our planning feel that we have the information that we need to make this decision today based on the geotechnical information we have.
Chairs, the staff report identified this as one of the matters we wanted to use the time to review new information coming into us on. That's what the staff report says.
Yeah, but the motion now is adding, category 1 lands into this and expanding it. So okay, I'll leave it at that. I think you have answered it a few times. And I guess my last question is, and I think Councillor Leeper asked it as well, but I'm going to re-ask it. Is the decision that we're being asked to make today as committee members and all of us at council, including the South March lands into the Taiwan land, is this decision to include those lands in the Taiwan lands consistent with the provincial policy statement? Or is it a political decision? I mean, I think it's got probably one or the other, maybe both. But
Chairs, the provincial policy statement is not a linear path to an answer in a lot of questions. And chairs, many councillors will have seen that in files in their wards. It represents a whole series of competing public interests that all have to be balanced against each other. And ultimately, elected councils have to make up their minds how you weigh the different challenges in it. The provincial policy statement does encourage development that's contiguous, but it also allows communities to take advantage of infrastructure for 17 highways. It allows it, it allows you to prioritize roads, and there are a number of different decisions in here. So as long as in balance, council has it in all of this collective decisions on what to add meets the provincial policy statement. Mr. Mark and I have indicated that yes, people may challenge it, but the minister will determine first and foremost whether they feel we have met the provincial policy statement, and it's the minister's decision that gets challenged potentially in court, not council's. So that's ultimately the path before council today. And I do believe that council has a right, more than it has in the past because of the no longer having appeals, to balance the provincial policy statement competing tests as you see best for Ottawa as the elected representatives.
Thank you. I guess that's the end of my questions. I don't know, Chair, if the map is available just to show how much of the land is actually Algonquin-owned land.
Yes, we do have the maps, Madam Chair. So this is the broader area that we've been referring to as Leitrim East, Carlsbad West. The lands highlighted in that pink color, as we understand it, and based on recent information from the registry office, are the lands owned by the Algonquins of Ontario.
And are you able to overlay on that the natural heritage?
Yes, that's a good segue to the second map. So the black hatching you see, which is primarily lands further to the east, are lands that are part of the natural heritage system as shown on the draft official plan schedule. So those would be heavily constrained in terms of environmental features, unevaluated wetlands, watercourses, and so on.
Okay, so that's more than half, well, more than half. And who owns the rest of the lands?
And that's your last question, unless you want to go back on the list.
Sure, yeah, it actually is my last question.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Madam Chair, there would be dozens, if not hundreds of owners in the area. We don't have a list of
Okay.
them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. Next up is Councillor Menard, followed by Councillor Leeper and Councillor Dudas. Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. And this kind of segues from Councillor McKinney's questions, more about the ownership of the lands. On our registry, we know who owns the roughly 1,000 hectares of lands being proposed for expansion. Is that correct?
Madam and Mr. Chair, we have a general awareness. That's not something we focused on in terms of the ownership, but there is a document in the report that outlines all the submissions and the owners in terms of those urban expansion requests.
Yes, and I read that and was looking yesterday when we had several submissions as well about the development companies that own a vast majority of these lands. Does staff have any concerns, environmental or otherwise, about the speculation that seems to be occurring in Ottawa?
Chair, if I may on this, I don't think the Planning Act gives staff the ability to use that as part of our considerations in the process. Lands are owned by, we cannot make a planning decision based on who owns it. I do not believe that is possible under the Planning Act and under legal systems that are allowed. You have to make it on the basis of the planning principles of the proposed use. So with respect, I don't think council can use that as a determining factor.
No, and with respect, I'm not asking that we do. It's more so asking if you have any concerns about land speculation that may be occurring in Ottawa.
Chair, I think it's true to say in any major city in any continent, if people sense that there is an opportunity to expand a city, that type of speculation will be occurring. If you talk to farmers who farm on the edges of the city or rural landowners, they will tell you they get talked to all the time. It's not something we have the powers under any bit of provincial legislation to control. It's not something the province has ever given the municipality any powers over, and it actually goes back to civil law as well, which is even beyond the legislative power.
Okay, moving on to some of the gating policies, and I just want to get clarity on where we're at with the motions, particularly point 5 in the recommendations in the document, Madam Chair. So on page 64 of the report, it says, if necessary, staff will also prepare gating policies for various expansion clusters with the intent that the conditions in the gating policies must be resolved prior to the next OP review. And then staff note that the 3 potential new communities under consideration in category 3 in Appendix C are located outside the limits of the natural area protections, and that the site alteration bylaw schedule could be amended again following ministerial approval of the new OP at council's discretion. I just on recommendation 5, if you can just clarify for myself, which ones are we saying will have a gating policy, a gating criteria, and which ones do not at this point? Is there any action that committee or council needs to take to ensure that gating is appropriately done, or are we covered by the current recommendations in the motion?
Madam Mr. Chair, yes, all the recommendations, whether it be for category 1 or if council draws from category 2 or 3, in staff's opinion, require gating or preconditions before development.
Okay, and under number 5 within the recommendations, the draft recommendations to committee, it seems that the distributed option has necessary recommendation for necessary gating policies for mobility and infrastructure. And then we've got the or number 2, and I don't see gating there in terms of the analysis of the category 3 lands. And then number 3, I don't think I see gating there either. I just to see clarity, are you looking for gating I've seen drafted gating policies throughout the documents. The drafts are there. Are all of those gating policies going to be included with whatever option we go forward with, or not? Or do we need to take more action to ensure that they are the draft gating policies you've put together?
So chairs, we have a delicate balance of maintaining available supply for 15 years for development under the provincial policy statement and gating policies. So one might readily believe that parcels that scored in the top category, which are already within our transit sheds, if you could call it, are areas that probably require no gating policies because they are proximate to existing infrastructure within the transit area. As you go down the list, we'll need progressively more gating policies to understand that. And a lot of those gating policies will come from the draft official plan and also what will come out of the transportation master plan, and development agencies. So, we'll ultimately can take council's direction on any gating topics you wish us to explore. That's up to council to advise us, but we as staff will link the development to the completion of those other various master plans and the gathering of additional information. As I said, a lot of these sites we also have the main policies in the official plan already, which talks about what's required for any land to open for development. And that includes a plethora of technical studies that are in the appendix to the draft official plan, a very, very long list of what's already required. So a lot of that information is already a requirement, regardless of what additional gating policies we pick. So, again, we can take further direction from council if required.
Okay, I'll follow up with you offline just to make sure I'm clear on it. I do see recommendation 4 has gating policies around the category 1 lands. That would be part of the draft official plan for appendices A and B. I see that there. But in some other recommendations, depending on the direction council takes, Taiwan Lands or something else, I want to make sure we've got those appropriate gating policies set up that have been drafted, it seems like, in the report as part of this. So I'll follow up with you offline to make sure that we've got that sorted and I get a good understanding of.
Can I just interrupt for a minute, because I know we have a revised Taiwan motion moved by Councillor Tierney, and I thought that it had a gating component in it. But when I'm reading that last be it therefore resolved, I don't see something that says that. But was that addition not about that? Was that not what Councillor Gower was asking, Vice Chair Gower was asking? Anybody?
This is Councillor Gower. Yes, that is what was intended with the friendly amendment. Policy and technical details that would essentially form a preconditions or a gating policy.
Perfect. I thought so. So it's important that next time, listening to the conversation, if anybody besides me knows that, please feel free to pipe up. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Councillor Menard.
That's okay. And the concern is more so if we don't go with that option, the Taiwan option, number 2 and number 3 under other point recommendation 5 don't seem to have those gating criteria there. So I wanted to just double.
So Chair, may I suggest, because I understand now what the councillor is saying, is that depending on the results of the votes today, staff will go back and revisit the language. And if we require something to add additional clarity, we'll bring that forward between now and then, because I do understand the point the council is making. There is just sort of a different level of information. But I want to reemphasize the point is because of the PPS requirement to have lands available, there has to be a gradation of gating, that not everything can be gated heavily or we won't meet that availability requirement. So we will propose it based on how the vote ends up through the course of today. But I understand the councilor's point and happy to talk to him further about it.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Willis. Do staff support any of the motions that have been brought forward today?
So Chair, let me go through the motions in order and give me a moment, please.
Could we hold on that, Councillor Menard, until we finish the general questions and before we start into the motions? And
Sure,
that gives Mr. Willis a chance to find that.
That makes sense, Chair. I'll just ask a final couple of questions here then. We had a delegation back in May, Mr. Davidson, who was advocating adding land that I believe he owned into the urban boundary area. There was a subsequent change to our scoring criteria by Councillor Hubley at the time around our transit lines. And so I'm just wondering, were the Davidson lands that he was advocating on advocated in past one or two, or added in past one or two, or not?
Yes, Madam and Mr. Chair, those lands did fall within category 1, pass 1 lands, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And then I just need an explanation from staff, if that's okay, just to explain what this means. In the report on page 65, it says a legal test has been adopted by the courts for a public meeting that members of council must be capable of being persuaded by submissions. The standard practice of council with respect to revisiting an issue will not apply when the public meeting takes place and the report from the public meeting is considered by council. Can you just explain that to me in a bit more detail so I understand?
Chairs, as I mentioned earlier today, well, I'll go the standard procedure. The standard procedure of council is that where council has made a decision on a matter that subject to reconsideration having been utilized, that matter cannot be revisited unless there is the affirmative vote of 3/4 of the members of council present and voting. And there are a couple of exceptions to that, but I won't go into it here. In this case, there is required by the Planning Act a statutory public meeting that will occur in the second quarter of this year. And then there'll be a council meeting after that. And the test of the courts apply to that is that the members of the Joint Committee and thereafter the members of council must be capable of being persuaded by either the written or the oral submissions that are made to the Joint Committee meeting. And therefore, it is my opinion that it would be inappropriate to impose upon such a meeting the procedural requirements that council has for revisiting an issue. Therefore, when matters come before the joint meeting and thereafter council, the standard voting requirements, i.e. a majority, in my opinion, apply.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. And I heard you talk about it earlier on in the meeting, but I was seeking a bit further clarity on that majority versus say a 2/3 vote or 3/4 vote, as you mentioned. Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. I just have a question.
Madam Chair, after your question, if I could raise a point of privilege, please.
Well, raise it now because the privilege outweighs a question of mine.
Okay, I'd like clarification on Councillor Menard's comment suggesting that my motion to do with transit lands had something to do to benefit an individual. I think that would be very inappropriate behavior that I would certainly not participate in. And I'd like Councillor Menard to clarify why he put his question that way and what was his intent or suggestion.
I can clarify. I'm not insinuating that they were related based on where the lands were. That's all I'm saying.
Lastly, Madam Chair, my motion had to do with transit citywide, so it wasn't related. I'll take this offline and speak to the city solicitor.
Okay, so before I go, thank you, Councillor Hubley. Before I go to Councillor Leeper and then Councillor Dudas and then Councillor Hubley. Councillor Hubley, are you back on the list? Okay, before I do that.
I'm going to come off for now, Madam Chair, and turn my camera off, okay, for a moment.
Okay, perfect. I just had a question about gating and you know, it's just come up probably more times than any other topic has today. And I'm just wondering, with the TMP not begun, not completed, not even in the works, is it not very difficult for you to go through this process? And at the same time, how do we make sure that there's not queue jumping involved so that somebody says, well, you know, we're counting on that for the 15-year inventory. We're going to have Boris O'Kane done before we go to Brian Coburn or take your pick. I mean, there's lots of Airport Parkway, any of that. How do we make sure that that's not an argument that's made since we're now looking at gating? I mean, we could have gating on any place. Definitely one of the reasons that Councillor El-Shantiri supported by Councillor Suds, Chair Elshinteri has put forward the motion he has is because you're not doing a gating review, I think, on the South March, but you darn well should. So, across the city, how do we make sure that that process of gating review doesn't interfere with TMP, which is only going to start under Councillor Chair Tierney's leadership in a couple of weeks or something?
So chairs, I'll start answering it. I have colleagues from transportation that may wish to add to what I have to say. First and foremost, this is a 25-year plan. This is lands to come in. They're not all coming in day one. As I explained earlier, we have lands that were added in the previous urban expansions that have not yet been opened up and been built on. There's still a process. So there is a logical flow of points opening over time. And council already often controls the levers of which determining which comes in at what time through the approval of secondary plans, through the approval of front-ending agreements, through the approval of the development charges bylaw. And ultimately, council has a great deal of discretion to meter out what happens, provided that we continue to provide the 15-year land supply that's required in the shorter time frame of immediately draft approved elements. It's also part of the PPS that we haven't talked about today, sort of the 3-year range. So these decisions are not things that are just going to roll out overnight. We're not going to have people who are moving in these new areas rolling over and expecting a draft approval of a subdivision next year. We will have lots of work to do. We have secondary plans that would need to be created. And as I said, it would roll into the development charges and the TMP and the like. And the TMP does have a prioritization built into it, and the current TMP stands until it's replaced. I don't know if anybody from Transportation Services would like to add to what I said.
Jennifer, are you wanting, is that why you came on? We can't hear you.
Hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, I was just going to say that I agreed with what Steve had said. Sorry.
There you go. All right, thank you for answering that question. Councillor Leeper, followed by Councillor Dudas, and that's all the hands I see now. And if there aren't any other ones on general questions, we are going to go into the motion segment. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks, Chair. And just to clarify, I do have intention of asking questions of staff and the movers of the motions as we move into that.
That's why we're using this process. So
thanks.
Thank you.
So the report, I just want to understand that Richcraft has brought suit against our decision to exclude the agricultural lands in our consideration. Just wondering from legal, when do we expect that to be decided or settled?
Chairs, the application has been filed with court. None of the background documentation has been filed by the applicants. As I expressed in the legal comment, it is my opinion that this application is significantly premature. I have some difficulty understanding why such an application was filed before the minister makes a decision, and that's a year from now. So I can't imagine this application being heard anytime soon, chairs.
So that has particular bearing on the Riverside South motion on which we're going to be asked to vote. Is it premature to consider that motion ahead of that decision?
Chairs, I would put my opinion 180 degrees the other way. It's a court application that is premature. I do not see why the existence of that application would affect any decision that council, the committee or council is going to make on the official plan. It is after such decisions are made that people should be considering whether or not to bring a court application.
Okay. Just to staff, one of the things that I'll be looking for as we discuss the Riverside South application is it possible to get some visuals on screen to take a look at which pieces of land might replace which when we get to that portion? And then I just want to make sure that I understand the process moving forward for the Taiwan Lands. If we were to vote first in favor of the inclusion of the Taiwan Lands as a new community focus in order to make up the additional 270 net hectares. What are the decision points and studies along the way? And then second, if we were to replace the South March Pass One lands and add those into the Taiwan Lands, what does that process look like moving forward?
So chairs, just to go back, is staff have asked council for direction on the remaining 270, and we provided you options on which to do, and we will work with whichever option it is. So this answer applies to whichever option it is. If it happens to be the Taiwan Lands, we would be requiring the proponents or the, I think in this case, it's fair to say our partners in the Algonquins of Ontario to give us additional information on the natural heritage features in the area, more precise information. We have general information. We would like more precise information. We understand there's more geotechnical information available. We'd like to see that. We'd like to see their projections of the cost estimates for providing servicing. We'd like to understand where they think the pipes are connecting to, the lengths of pipes, cost estimates for those pipes. There's a great deal of technical information. But again, that would be very similar to information we require in the opening of a new secondary plan, whether it be Fern Bank or other areas. It's just that we, being a new community, it is a little bit different than kind of bolting on something to the side of an existing developed area. It does make it a little bit more complicated. So there's a whole list of technical studies in the draft official plan we bring forward in June. It'll list those studies that are required so that it's very clear when council adopts what information we need.
Do we continue to hold the hammer to say this is not feasible? And then what happens?
So there are lands that, that don't get approved in a timely way because there are technical issues outstanding, and those lands remain in the inventory for several years until those technical issues are resolved. Lands don't need to be approved prematurely if there are massive technical issues sitting out there. We will prioritize the lands within the inventory that are the least technical issues to get them online early. But it is a delicate balancing act. We always have to meet the 15-year test.
But it sounds to me like the decision to explore those Category 3 lands focused on the single new community option is almost irrevocable, that those lands are going to be added into the inventory with little practical ability to bring them back out.
Chairs, council at any time can choose to change an official plan designation, but ultimately you understand that there's consequences to revoking an approval. We had examples brought to us on the table of historic plans of subdivision that have been draft approved that still stand today and have not been advanced to development state, and our ability to revoke those is very limited. So council is making a decision. If council makes the decision to add these lands, then that is what we are focusing in on, and we'll constantly need to review the status of that to meet our land requirements under the PPS.
And that study is going to happen over, so our initial request of them to offer us documents, that's going to be over the next 5 years or so. And then we're going to hit 2026, and we're going to have to be able to ensure land supply. Is that, because it is already in the urban boundary, it doesn't sound like that would force us to try to find more, that we won't have decided by then that it's undevelopable.
Chairs, much like as I said earlier, we have lands today in 2021 that are in the urban boundary today that are not yet developed, that were put in 2013. So, there is time for these things to evolve, and it's a rolling review at all times of our 15-year land supply, and we'll need to look at this very carefully and ensure that we continue. And again, that's presuming that in this time period, the provincial policy statement doesn't change, because it has in the past changed. It just changed last year. That used to be a 10-year rolling requirement that the government changed to 15. So we have to be cognizant that change could happen.
Okay. No, that's helpful. Thank you. And then I look forward to the discussion of the motion specifically.
Thank you. And I see no more hands.
hold on, I thought Council Dudas have her hand up.
But she did, but it's not there anymore.
It was specific to one of the motions, so I'll go back.
Okay, so no one else has any general motions then? Okay, we're going to go back to introduce the motions and have, and not to read it again because we've already done that, but just to say, I'll go and I'll say, for example, Councillor Hubley, and I think, yeah, you're back. Councillor Hubley, give us a genesis for your motion on 2026 new official plan review. Okay, so that's why we'll proceed. And then we will go with, then we'll have a discussion about that if anybody has any questions. Does everybody have any copies of the motions that you want? And does anyone at all have any other motion or direction that they'd like to provide to Melody at this time? Okay.
So should we vote on a?
So we're going to go, should we, so Mr. Mark, would you prefer that we go on the technical amendment first?
Madam Chair, I have considered what would be an appropriate order for the motions if you'd like to hear it.
Sure, why don't you tell us that?
Madam Chair, it seemed to me that an order that makes sense is, yes, the technical one should be first, then the motion with respect to industrial lands, then the 2026 review motion.
You're talking about the Hubley motion, the industrial lands?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Then the 2026 review motion.
Okay.
Riverside South, South
Okay.
March, and then Taiwan.
Okay, and then there are directions.
Yes, Madam Chair.
All right, so the technical amendment is being moved by Chair El Shantiri. So I don't know that you really need to speak to it. It's a technical amendment. Does anyone want to raise a hand to speak about the technical amendments?
Okay, that's it.
No? So is that item carried?
Carried.
Thank you, everyone. The next one is Councillor Hubley's one on industrial lands. Would you like to speak to that, Councillor Hubley?
Sure. Madam Chair, I've been discussing this one with Councillor Moffat as well. What it is a piece of land right up to 416 where the Barrhaven and Canada storage units are, that under review and additional studies, the Lear score has changed on that land, at least some of it. And as Councillor Moffat said, there's one more report that's due in certainly in the weeks ahead on it. So if that changes the overall Lear score, what this does, this motion protects that land can come in under this review. And that's why the wording on the bottom as suggested by staff is that staff will come back to council by June on whether or not this piece should come in. And if possible, if you want to ask Councillor Moffat if that's his agreement as well, or understanding as well, that should explain that motion.
Councillor Moffat?
Yeah, thanks for that. There was a motion that was circulated that had the wrong wording, and that's one that I was concerned about. Councillor Hubley's motion here does speak to that, so it gives chance to staff to do that review. Otherwise, I would have referred the other one to June anyways. So it gives a chance to have that review. It's no different really than what we're doing as a part of Lear and some of the follow-ups to Lear in the Munster area to some of the lands there, and offering property owners the ability to go out and get their own assessment of the soils specific to the quality of those parcels. So I'm interested in seeing that report because again, the only data I have on it right now says that it does score well. I'll be interested to see that report come, and then we can talk about it further in June. So thanks.
Yeah.
That would be great if you can report back to us once you see that information. Okay, we'll count on you to do that. Anything else, Councillor Hubley?
Yeah, just to be crystal clear on this, we're not changing the staff process. We're just trying to give staff a little more time to complete what they're doing on these files, and to recognize that applicants have put a lot of effort into working with staff. So to give them a little more leeway, that's all it is.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Leeper has a question on the industrial lands. Councillor Leeper?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious from staff, they didn't identify the need for additional lands. Do they support the inclusion of these parcels if the Lear score comes in at the right level?
The chairs, we identified a range of lands in the report last year to come in, and it's about securing lands, the 400 series highways and the interchanges for this industrial freight and storage use, so it doesn't get used for other purposes. The limitation is the agricultural lands, and we did not score this or identify this because of the limitation of the agricultural lands. If that had not been in place, this would have been a very strong candidate, and it would have been given serious consideration. But until staff gets evidence that it is not higher priority agricultural lands, we're in no position to give you an answer on it.
Thanks. And would that come back to council if you determined that you did want to?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. So on the Hubley motion on the new official plan of growth management report 2, lands proposed for residential and industrial urban expansion, is that carried?
Carried.
Carried, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next up is another Hubley motion. This one is the 2026 new official plan review considerations. Why are you moving this, Councillor Hubley?
It's similar to the other one, but broader in that what I want to do is protect the work that staff has undertaken where they haven't made final decisions on properties that we are reviewing. And again, it gives the applicants an opportunity to finish that process and provide any additional info they have on it. And what it says is that maybe we're not bringing in these lands during this particular process, but we will have them scored and ready to come in at a later date if needed.
Thank you. And earlier, Councillor Menard was talking about how will we know if intensification is actually happening at a higher pace, and what do we need less lands to come in? This also gives us the opportunity to, on an annual basis, to look at whether or not the intensification is not meeting the objectives or the targets as well, so that we can adjust accordingly, whether it's density in certain communities or whatever. We don't know. It's an either or kind of a thing. Councillor Leeper has a question.
Is any of it work that is not otherwise foreseen to be done?
You mean on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
when I take a look at the ADR and, you know, these seem like numbers that we're coming up with fairly regularly, but.
Chair, the council is correct that we do monitor for many of these items and do report on these. I think there's more specificity in that, you know, I think staff are understanding Councillor Hubley's intent to us to look at some specific things. He's identified, for example, the very bizarre times we're in with the pandemic and the post-pandemic effect, and whether this is a short-term trend or a long-term trend. So there are certain matters in the motion that go beyond what we would it's not in what we've traditionally looked at, so it goes a little further and looks at some new items. So staff consider this a friendly recommendation and have no concerns with it.
Thanks, Chair.
And helpful in the TMP too. Councillor Brockington, questions?
I was just going to
Comments?
ask Mr. Willis if he has the staff capacity to do this type of annual analysis. I mean, I like what's being asked for. I think it's important data to follow, but you do have the staff capacity to do what's being asked?
So chairs, we already produce annual reports. Mr. Food's team does a great job. They're actually really excellent reports. I think put them on par with any other municipality in Ontario. And there are some additional considerations in this, and we're going to look carefully at this, and we may bring in some outside specialized consulting expertise to support some of these market trends questions that Councillor Hubley's identified, because we may not see these with the data available to us. So I'll address that in future budget submissions if required as a sort of additional professional services support.
Is everything being asked for useful for what you need?
Chair, I think these are all very reasonable asks. I think my colleagues across the planning profession are looking at some of these issues right now, and I think it's prudent to collect this information and put it before council for future decision making.
Good. I will support it. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. I don't see any other hands waving. So on the Hubley motion on 2026 new official plan review considerations, that item's carried.
Carried.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, the next motion up is moved by Councillor Meehan. Hi, Caroline.
Hi.
If you'd like to speak to why you're doing this on the Riverside South swap.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I would like to talk about this. And, you know, 3 years ago, if you had told me that I was going to, before I was elected councillor, that I would be before a city committee right now arguing for more development in Riverside South, specifically on agricultural land, I would have laughed at you, because it just goes against everything that I believe. Yet here I am introducing this motion to include this parcel of land. Why? Because it's both illogical to not do that, and in the long run, if we don't allow it, it's going to cost us the city a whole heck of a lot more money. Riverside South is growing, one of the fastest growing communities in the South End, next to Barhaven, and for good reason. In just a little bit more than a year, and you've all been told that in 2022, the Trillium Line will be open in Riverside South, and it's going to connect Riverside South up to the airport and right into the heart of the city. So, and the train is going to come right into the heart of Riverside South, into what's going to be our new town center. Riverside South is going to reap the benefits of this, of being a truly transit-oriented community serviced by 2 LRT stations. That's the Limebank station, the terminus, and the Bowesville station. And if you're out that way, you'll see that the construction is going very, very quickly on these 2. So it's going to complete the picture, a new 15-minute community, except for that one glaring hole that now exists. On the south side of the rail line, we've had to exclude attractive land that is designated agricultural. You know, and I voted to protect agricultural lands like you all did. It's important, and I stand by that principle. However, at this point, it doesn't really make sense in Riverside South. The designation means that there's going to be nothing more than fields between those 2 LRT stations. And I think it's really incumbent on me to remind everybody at this point that the city has made a huge investment in the Trillium Line in Riverside South, over $150 million in infrastructure and $33 million alone in the Bowesville Park and Ride. And if those lands continue to sit idle, as they will if we don't pass this motion, the only way that people are going to get to the Bowesville Park and Ride is if they take cars. There will be no homes to support what we've done there. So what we're suggesting in this motion is that we remove 106 hectares, just 106 from the 53,000 hectares that are now provided, and allow that land to be transit-oriented development. And this is not an easy ask. This is not an easy ask for me. And I wouldn't be here, though, if it didn't make sense. The land swap proposed, that 106 hectares, I believe will make this motion even more reasonable, hopefully, to a lot of you. And the planning staff support the swapping of the lands because they recognize that this will foster transit-oriented development and increase ridership at the Bowesville stations. Expansion will remain north of Rideau Road, which I think is really important because those communities will be built close to transit. And then we will have Rideau Road basically as a buffer or a new community urban, like a boundary line on the south end. So it will be clean and everybody will know where development is going to stop. And I think perhaps probably the most important part is the development of the proposed development of this new gold belt at 3.5 times larger than what we've got in the current green belt. It'll ensure that there'll be no more encroachment into the rural lands. So I'm asking everybody's support today for this motion because I think it makes total sense. We've already made the investment, and by not supporting the development in this parcel of land, we're not going to maximize our investment. So for those reasons, I'm asking you to support this motion. Thank you.
Well said, Councillor Meehan, and you have certainly caused some interest. We have Councillor DeRuse, followed by Councillor Leeper, Councillor Moffat, Councillor Kitts. Councillor DeRuse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can I ask staff to put the map Councillor Leeper asked earlier? He liked to see the map and the land that they were really extended beyond Rideau Road. I'd like to make a few comments on that. While the map is coming up, I do support Councillor Meehan. It makes a lot of sense. And if you look at, it is very difficult for me as rural councillor to support a redesignation from an agricultural land, but this specific land, it makes sense because I personally, as a rural councillor, don't like to see the growth going past Rideau Road. And unfortunately, the land was highlighted in green. It scored in the number as a category 2. But if you can see, it actually will encroach into coming to Greeley and coming to Mitch Owens. And for us, it makes sense to actually, if you look at west side of Bowesville and why we're leaving all this vacant area where the farming in it anyway, these land, they're not really good farming land. And secondly, we're spending, look at the proximity of the LRT station like Councillor Meehan was mentioning. We can't leave that loophole or a land, empty land in the middle, 1 kilometer away from our LRT station that we're spending a lot of money, and then yet allowing encroachment and growth happening to the south of Rideau Road. So I do understand, if you look at the picture, it's explained a lot. And sometimes the picture is actually better than thousand words. I do support Councillor Meehan, and unfortunately, I do agree with her on the logic that why we should redesignate those lands. And hopefully the committee will see that also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Chair El-Shantiri.
I'll wait to the end. Let them speak first.
All right.
I'll wait to the end.
All right, so next up, we have Councillor Leeper, followed by Councillor Moffat and Councillor Kitts.
You come back. Yeah.
Thanks. Can we put that map back up, please?
Like now.
I thought you want to see it, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, George. Thank you. So what would the swap be? Are staff able to sort of show us which lands would?
So Chair, Chairs, if I may, we haven't mapped it out yet, but the idea was you take the land area that's in green and you fill in that area of that nub and go as far south as you can with that. And we probably talked to the landowner to figure out exactly the best configuration of that, tucking that in. But the intent is to try to close in the area that's between white and yellow with the equivalent amount of land that's green.
Okay. And sorry, so someone was just using their cursor to kind of show the rough area where that would be. Could they do that again? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so these are the twists that we get into when we agree to expand the urban boundary. There's a couple of, I'm struggling with this one. There's two really important public interests here. The preservation of agricultural land, which is something that we all agreed was critical, even as we expand the urban boundary. And, the efficient use of land and particularly transit. And, certainly I consider that sustainable transit is critical to the future of this city. I'm just wondering if transportation staff could weigh in on what the implications are of going south of Rideau River Road and leaving those areas unpopulated. What would the advantage be to putting that parcel much, much closer to our LRT line?
Chairs, I can say that the advantage of putting the land closer to the LRT line primarily is to promote walking and cycling to that LRT connection. It's also more efficient to serve from a feeder bus perspective, but really it's because you would be within a walking and cycling distance as opposed to the lands that are much further to the south.
Can you quantify that?
It's tricky off the top of my head, but I do know that from other rapid transit stations we've seen in the city that the walking and cycling mode share drops quite significantly the further that you travel from the station, and the scoring actually for the land parcels was set up to capture that effect, so that parcels within the 300 to 600 meters scored higher than parcels that were at that 1.9 kilometer radius, and that was set up to reflect that.
That the green parcel, the past two lands, I'm trying to make sense of the scale that's there. It looks like those are 2 kilometers away, say to the corner or the northern edge.
I believe they were within a 2.5 kilometer travel distance by road to the LRT station, and that was why they were included as a past two lands.
Here's, if I may assist Jennifer, the dashed line on the map, which is faint, shows the capture area around the stations where we believe the highest walking and cycling would be, which would be less than 2 kilometers. So that should give you, the council's right, it's 1.9 kilometers is the dashed line.
Okay, yep, thank you. The sustainability of our light rail and its feasibility, has it been, it has been conceived of in the context of those parcels remaining undeveloped?
Yes.
Chair, I'll leave it there. I'm curious to hear from my colleagues. This is a couple of really important public interests that are at odds with one another as a result of our decision to expand the boundary.
Thank you very much, Councillor Leeper. And we go through the list. I believe Councillor Moffitt was next. Councillor Moffitt.
Thank you. So what this motion does, what this motion says, is that transit is more important than agriculture. Transit trumps agriculture. There's a transit station close, so agriculture doesn't matter anymore. Transit is the moving target. Agriculture is not. Agriculture is there. Agriculture cannot be moved. Transit can be moved. Transit is coming to Stittsville. An LRT station will be built on Robert Grant, not too far from south of Fernbank. What's south of Fernbank? Agricultural lands, prime agricultural lands. Agricultural lands that score exactly the same as these lands. So let's not apply some logic that this is logical land to grow on because transit is close to it. Transit can move. Transit can be close to other agricultural lands. Transit in the future can be close to south of Hope Side Road. You grow further south, you bring transit along with it. You go south of Fernbank, you go down to Fluellen, you bring transit with it. Now you go south of Fluellen down to Fallowfield, you bring transit with it. Next thing you know, we're connecting Richmond to transit. And now all north of Richmond is agricultural land, because that's the decision you make. Once you decide that you take lands that score 172, 168, 161, 160 in the Lear, lands that have not been refuted as agricultural lands, even though other landowners owning similar lands have produced reports, have taken the time to produce soils reports to argue our soils data. No one took the time to do that here. Why? Because they can't, because the land's agriculture. They're relying on council to make a decision that transit trumps agriculture. It doesn't, it shouldn't. And even if that was the case, the past two lands are actually closer to LRT than the land that scores 172. So let's not be foolish and sit here and think that some of these lands or all of these lands are closer to transit than the past two lands that we're swapping out. Because the past two lands, again, I'll say it, are closer to transit than the piece of land that scores 172 in the Lear. So today you're going to pick a prime piece of agricultural land, a piece of land that scores higher than 99% of agricultural lands in this city. And you're going to add it to the urban boundary, even though it's further from transit than the lands that you're swapping with it. So logic doesn't belong here. If you want to have a logical boundary, it's agricultural land. If you decide that agricultural land is not a logical boundary, then the gold belt doesn't matter. The agricultural resource area doesn't matter, because you're choosing today that something else is more important than agriculture. All the way through the Lear process, and I chaired the Lear working group, as you all know, and I keep on reminding people because I like to do that stuff. 2012 to 2016, we constantly kept on having the discussion of what conflicts with agriculture. Nothing conflicts with agriculture. We made our LEAR structure so that agriculture was the prime use and that everything else around it is a conflict with agriculture, but agriculture isn't a conflict with it because agriculture is the prime use. It has to be the primary use. So I can't support this. There's a reason why we had a motion in front of committee back in May that said no agricultural lands will be considered. These lands we knew about then, because when we had that motion on the table, the owners of these lands came to our committee and said, don't do this, consider these lands. The transit station, we decided it was going to go there a few years ago. We decided it was going to go there before May of 2020. We decided to protect these agricultural lands in May of 2020. What's changed between May of 2020 and today? The transit didn't change. The agricultural scores didn't change. So what's changed between May of 2020 and today? I asked that. And every single one of you should ask that same thing. When you vote for this motion, you should ask yourself, can you answer what has changed on these lands that would make you vote differently today than you voted in May of 2020 to protect these in the first place? And to be clear, we all did. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Moffitt and Councillor Kitts.
I probably am not going to give comments that are as eloquent as Councillor Moffitt just did, but it was really that was my question. I wasn't here for the decision in May, but the way that I understand it is that at that time, these conversations were had. If there are lands that are close to municipal services or transit, should they be considered? And I believe at that time there was an argument that maybe they should be considered and maybe we shouldn't put a full stop on all agricultural land. So I guess my question was just, does this open the door for everybody else who feels like their land would be a good fit based on the fact that it's close to transit or it's close to municipal services? Because I think there are other landowners in other parts of the city that feel like their land should have consideration at some point, but we've identified that they're agricultural and that they're part of the Gold Belt.
Is that a question, Councillor Kitts?
I mean, I guess my question is, do we open the door to that idea?
Mr. Willis can speak because he's been asked this question to the number of other opportunities that are the same in the city.
So chairs, I respect the question that Councillor asks. It is a pivotal question the Council has to decide today. I was asked whether staff would support this particular situation. And the reason staff would support this particular situation is this is not a planned transit network. It's an under construction transit station. It's actually there. It's actually physically already there. We would, having declared what Council decision made in May, and with any future ones, they will have had plenty of notice that we would never again support another one. This would be the last. And I think that's the limitations on staff's position on this, because the very Councillor Leeper said it quite eloquently. This is a competition of public interests. Council is going to have to weigh which interests it wish to add priority to. As I see it, the public interests again weighed up against each other, as Councillor Moffitt has been a passionate spokesperson for the agricultural lands, and I could never speak as passionately about it as he can. On the other side, the 5 big moves in the 15-minute neighborhoods and the opportunity to build the first prototype of a 15-minute neighborhood on land with a station that will be open before development ever comes. So that's why this is a unique situation. Staff would never support in any other location this type of swap.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I can tell you that as a person who was a member of the sponsor group on the official plan, and certainly Councillor Moffitt, Councillor Blais at the time, Councillor El-Shantiri, Councillor Hubley, and Councillor Tierney, and Councillor Gower. I think I have that right. We were very, very clear with staff on 6 occasions saying no agricultural land. This is before council had it before you, just when we started planning, no agricultural land. What should have happened is, because it took us 6 times to get to so that they were actually listening. It was because of this location. What they should have done is said, counselors, you are aware of this situation. They didn't do that. So, Councillor Kavanaugh. Councillor Kavanaugh?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you. Maybe I'm going to ask a stupid question, but how did we end up with the transit station if we knew it was agricultural land?
Is that a question to staff? Because that, I believe.
Yes, yes.
So chairs, I'm going to do my best because these decisions were made before I was here. I mean, one of the reasons why we have it is we were using an existing rail corridor for the north-south component of the Trillium line, and at some point it had to turn west towards Riverside South. And the advantage of this site was the city already owned the land on which the station is to be situated and didn't have to go out and buy that land, which would reduce the costs. The other element is it ties in south closer to the town center as part of the alignment. Mr. Migueles may have more to tell a little about the history. Some of this predates my time with the city.
Yeah.
But I think that's the primary consideration is the fact that we own the land that the station was on, is why that was the pivot point in the line.
No, it actually, you weren't here. And nobody, I think, on the screen was here, maybe Chair El Shantiri. But this was part of the North-South LRT. Okay, that was voted on and passed by a council in June 2006, that after the election in December of 2006 killed the North-South freaking LRT. Okay, so I'm not, in addition to losing like $100 million plus, we also had already purchased land. Okay, and we already knew that Riverside South, which was added in 1979, I believe, to that satellite story, you know, the one you heard about yesterday, that was the Canada, Orleans. This was outside the Greenbelt that decision was made. The South, the Barrhaven, South Ottawa, they added Riverside South into it. That's how far this story goes back. And, you know, the first part of the O train, of the whole rapid transit in the city, went to Greenboro Station. I don't think Councillor Deans is in the room with us, or she could certainly speak to it as well. But it does have that kind of history.
Yeah, but we're designating it as agricultural land now.
Liz, who's talking now? Oh, Councillor Kavanaugh. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. We're saying that it's prime agricultural land, so I'm just puzzled on how that happened. But thank you for the history, and I'm sorry if I touched a sore point.
No, it's not. I just thought it was important, and also Councillor Moffat could speak to you about when we finally had a Lear report, and that timing was very recent too. Yeah. And I would say that there's some people now that are very sorry that they didn't challenge whether they were right or not. We have some landowners that challenged the Lear report and were successful or not successful, and nobody challenged on this one. And even though they knew when the Lear was passed that the plans for the North-South LRT and continued transit into South Ottawa was part of the plan. So that's really, sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. I think it's actually part of what we should know. I think it's important to have that history and put it in context of what's happened. I'm concerned about this because everyone's saying, no, it won't set a precedence, but I'm very concerned about it. And in Ottawa, we have a history of having big chunks of land that are not to be developed. I'm going to give you the example of Moody Station, which will be surrounded by Greenbelt, and there will not be development there. So it's not the first time this has happened. That's happening, and we're crossing our fingers that continues to be that Moody Station at the end of the Stage 2 line will not have development around it. it will not have the intensification. So unless somebody's going to say, well, we'll just make another change. But of course, it's green belt and it's NCC. But so I do get concerned about precedents of these things. And I also wonder about, why is agricultural land considered such a bad thing in terms of being near things? Why can't it be embraced and integrated? I'm looking at what's happened in Chelsea, where they have the Hendrick Farm right beside them, and they have market gardening. We've talked about the whole movement of foods, and this is to me a possibility that we embrace it, that it's within the city limits, that we look at it another way, that it's not just big, cornfields, that we can have it as part of the community. So I think there's opportunities as well. So I appreciate that, that agriculture land is important, because we're not going to invent more of it. And I think it is important to hold on to. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. I only see Councillor Meehan's hand. You already spoke, right, Councillor Meehan? So
yeah, thank you, Chair. No, just a couple of points. Councillor Moffat is right. This is prime agricultural land, although not all of it scored 170, as he said. Some of it's 125, some of it's 150. So just to clarify that. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, the city's already made a sizable investment in these two LRT stations, and to have the residential component in this parcel of land, I think it would go a long way to completing a loop. It's not just the train going into Limebank Station, the center of Riverside South. At that point, we're also going to have the BRT, which is going to link Riverside South right up into Barrhaven, into the Barrhaven Town Center. So the people who will live in Riverside South, if this motion is accepted today, or we vote on it, the people who will live there can also work in Barrhaven, which is growing exponentially. You know that. We've seen Amazon, we have more manufacturing going in there. These people will support the rail line and the BRT. $100 million investment, and as a fiscal conservative, I don't want us to be throwing money away. I also agree that, we have to protect our ag land, but we're going to swap. I think the swap will work here. It's written into the motion that this will not, this will be an exclusive deal. It only makes sense in this area right now because of it will complete the whole transit-oriented area. And if you were to go out to these lands, what would you see? Nothing much different than it's just land sitting there. One side of Bowesville Road looks very much like the side on the other side of Bowesville that we're talking about. That the land is you can't tell the difference of what it is. One side is protected and the other side isn't. In a perfect world, yeah, we wouldn't need this. But I think that given the situation that we're living in today, we need sustainable transit. And I think we need this development right now. So we could put in community gardens or something later on. There's going to be all kinds of space for that. But this makes so much sense on so many different levels. So that's why we're arguing for it now. Let's do what we're supposed to do, get this rail line in. Next year, like, it's exciting. We're going to have transit right across from downtown, right through Riverside South, over into Barrhaven. It's going to be a complete loop, and it's something a lot of other communities are envious of right now. So let's put the people in there that can support it. That's it. Thanks.
Councillor Moffat, I see you put your hand up again.
Yeah, I'm aware that Councillor Meehan was on wrap up, but unfortunately mentioned my name, so gives me the opportunity to come back and speak. Just to be clear on the scoring, considering we want to have clarity, the lands between River Road and Spratt, north of Rideau, score 172. The lands between Spratt and Limebank score 168. And 161. The lands north of Rideau Road west or east of Spratt score 160 and 151. The tiny, tiny parcels to the east of that along Albion Road do score 125 and 116. Those two parcels make up, I would say, about 10% of the total land mass of this area. 125 is the threshold for Lear, for evaluating Lear when it comes to what should be designated as agriculture resource area in our official plan. One small parcel scores 116, then 125, and the rest is all above 150. 90% of that land is above 150. 150 is well above the 125 threshold. So let's not minimize the land and pretend that I'm fudging numbers when it comes to the scoring. The scoring is all available. You can visit the map online. Anyone can check it if they'd like, and they can check the scores and they compare it to the other scores around the city as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Moffat. I don't think anyone dispute the scoring, Councilor. But I want to speak a little bit before we talk about this motion. As the chair of the Agricultural Rural Affairs Committees, I can tell you, this is one of the toughest decisions we have to make. I'm the one who brought the motion in May to protect our agricultural plan. And I was so grateful, majority of my colleagues, all of my colleagues, as a matter of fact, voted for that motion. And I do believe firmly in protecting our agricultural lands. But in the meantime, we are protecting 53,000 hectares in the Gold Belt, essentially for our future food security, environmental protection, and overall financial sustainability for infrastructure. But with this particular motion, I also have to admit it, this location makes sense for transit-oriented development. And I agree, yes, you can change the station, but that should be done 5 years ago, not when the train's going to be running next year. We should have done this 5 years ago and not include that parcel or change the location of the tracks 5 years ago, not today. Unfortunately, the direction we had at the time to the staff did not say that the agricultural land is a sacred, do not go near it. That's something I take responsibility in it as well. I also agree that one-time opportunity that we shouldn't miss if we are committed really to transit-oriented community. Yes, it is really important to stop further development on Rideau Road. We need to protect encroachment onto our rural area, and this motion does that. I think also that design transit-oriented development in this location reduce the pressure for the encroachment onto the Gold Belt in the medium and the long term. Protecting that Gold Belt is important to all of us. I thought it is not easy for me to say this. I think the using of the 106 hectare for transit-oriented development helps protect the remain of the 53,000 hectare and make the most out of our investment in a light trail to Bowisville, which is I voted for. And I don't want to hatch something from the past, but Councillor Harder is right. That's the land was designated from day one, from early 2000 for the north-south, the LRT. Folks, I am voting for this motion. And let me tell you, I don't take a pleasure of doing this, but my reconciliation is we are protecting 53,000 hectares in the Gold Belt by doing this today. So I hope to count on your support to Councillor Meehan. And if there's, for some reason, there's another way of doing this between now and council on February 10th, let's all work together with our staff. But I find it in the last, I doubt it in the last minute we're going to find a solution to this. So therefore, I would be supporting for the motion, and we're going to ask for ayes and nays on this motion. Melody?
I'm going to do it.
So if you want to speak to it.
No, I'm going to just do I have the list in front of me. Okay, Councillor Dudas. This is on the Councillor Meehan motion on Riverside South. Councillor Dudas.
Yes.
Councillor Tierney.
Yes.
Councillor Leeper.
No.
Councillor Brockington.
Yes.
Councillor Kitts.
Yes.
Counselor Giroux,
Yes.
Counselor Moffat,
No.
Counselor Meehan,
Yes.
Counselor Hubley, I think you're on mute, Alan.
Yes, I voted yes.
Sorry. Vice Chair Gower,
Yes.
Chair Elshintiri,
Yes.
and myself, yes. 10-2. Thank you very much, everybody. Next up, we have Counselor Elshintiri again, and this time, oh, it's like a repeat performance. This is on the marshlands, remove marshlands. Counselor Elshintiri, if you want to tell us why you have this before us today.
He's on mute.
There you go.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, colleagues, for putting up with us in the last couple of days. We heard from our resident in the area, and this area I'm familiar with, and some of you are, we call it Area 1, which is Canada North expansion, which is Councillor turned it down in the past when it was recommended for expansion. But OMB hearing inside the Area 1, which is called Canada North today, is agreed to grant it. It's been done 10 years ago, and today we have not one house built on that area. Still, even council at the time, 10 years ago, felt the need to keep the city moving and didn't find March Road is the only alternative for that area. Basically, most of West Carleton come to March Road early in the morning and go back on March Road in the evening. So that's basically meant our own major connection between Canada and South March and West Carleton. Also in that area, folks, we have 5 existing country state lot subdivisions. And we're recommending expanding the urban boundary around those 5 subdivisions. In the past, when they were building on the east side of Old Cart Road, the developer was forced by the MOE to buy a couple of homes and provide water for the corner of Rich and Side Road. And one of them is the dentist's office, and the other building was a plastic surgeon. The reason I say that, because the bedrock in that area is so severe, and they have to use heavy explosion to the point where they have impact and shifting the water for the people who live there and have an impact on their well and septic. And some of them, they did damage to their, and we have it that all that is reported. I believe we still have that in the city. So I can read the motion again. Whereas recommendation 3 of staff report identify a cluster of land shown as South March 175.35 net hectare as a potential area to be identified for urban expansion dependent on result of further analysis and study. And where this is a challenging area to develop due to the exclusive reliance on March Road, the adjacent country residential subdivision, and the proximity to the South March Highland. So much so that council has previously, as I said earlier, rejected expansion onto this area, only to have been overruled by the Ontario Municipal Board. Whereas the land identified are difficult and expensive to serve due to the bedrock condition and the potential impact on the 5 adjacent country residential subdivisions. And whereas further expansion in this area toward Dunrobin and the South March Highland may stir speculation, land investment, and further investment, which is also contrary to the city intent to prevent encroachment on villages. So basically the land, once you go to that area, all the way to Woodlawn is all general rural and could be developed if we open that door. Therefore, be it resolved that Joint Planning and Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee recommend that Council approve that South March land cluster identified in recommendation 3 be removed and that the land supply 175.35 net hectare be added to the new community option in recommendation 5 of the staff's report as amended. That's my motion.
Thank you, Chair El-Shantiri. And I'd just like to ask for clarification because we're doing this in the order that it was advised by legal, but I am asking again for clarification. You heard the motion from Chair El-Shantiri. I'm surprised that the Tierney motion doesn't go first because of the way that that's written. Can I ask for clarification, please, before I go to speakers?
Chair, this motion suggests that the lands be added to recommendation 5. Then the Tierney motion by Councillor Tierney deals with how recommendation 5 is to be implemented. Therefore, it made sense to me that we should first know how many lands are subject to recommendation 5 before we deal with, before committee deals with the decision under recommendation 5.
So if the El-Shantiri motion passes on South March, then there has to be a change in the Tierney motion on Taiwan to include a different number.
That is one option, Madam Chair. It's joint committee could take a view that the 270 should be dealt with one way and the 175 another way. That's a possible option. Or a committee could indeed decide that instead of the Tierney motion reading 270, it will read 445. But in any event, it did seem to me that this motion should be decided first.
And you're the expert, so that's why I asked you. We do have people asking questions, and first up is Councillor Brockington, followed by Councillor Leeper. Councillor Brockington.
Thanks, Chair. Just a question for Councillor El-Shantiri. I just want to better understand if his motion and Councillor Tierney's motions are married, or whether in the absence of a motion from Councillor Tierney, whether Councillor El-Shantiri would have proposed this motion anyway. Is it directly linked to Councillor Tierney's motion, or would you have done this anyway because you saw the need in your community?
I would have done it regardless, Councillor Brockington, because that area, it does not make sense. You know it very well, and you know the only way you can enter West Carleton is March Road, and we are choked already without even any development.
Okay. The staff, if Councillor El-Shantiri's motion is successful, but Councillor Tierney's motion is not, what happens?
So Chair, staff in the staff report asked council for further direction on the 270. So what we would now be asking for further direction on 445. So at some point, we would hope that council would give us direction of which of the options we've put in our report you would prefer we focus in on as we complete the draft official plan.
Okay, thank you. And my final question is, can you just comment further, remind us your professional comments on the El-Shantiri motion?
So Chair, staff stand by the report as presented. We did identify these lands based on the criteria we had presented. They did score high. We acknowledge the concerns Councillor El-Shantiri raised, and those are documented in the report that, you know, scoring systems are not perfect. They don't pick up on necessarily all of these considerations. So we understand it. We will follow council's will on this issue.
Okay, thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Leeper, followed by Councillor Kitts.
Thanks, Chair. And, you know, my question is for staff as well. This is Pass 1 land. Do staff agree that it is just too difficult to develop to include? I'm paraphrasing the whereas clauses of the motion, but you know, I'm trying to reconcile that motion with the clear pass that it got in the scoring.
So Chair, staff stand by that what's in the staff report, that it is possible to bring these lands online. We acknowledge that building in and around 5 or 6 different country residential state subdivisions makes it extra difficult. Without further study, I'm not sure how that integration will work. So I'm not going to dispute Councillor El-Shantari's point on that. That is, that this is not as easy as some bare land, such as we have proposals in South Barrhaven and Stittsville that are a lot simpler to deal with than this. This would not be an easy one to do, but staff do believe they're developable. But we will follow council's will on this issue.
The one of the whereas clauses speaks to, forgive me, I'm just pulling it up on screen, further expansion in this area towards Dunrobin and the South March Highlands may serve speculative land investment for future investment. Is that not a dynamic that comes about every time we have an expansion?
Chairs, I think the point, and I'm not going to speak for Councillor El-Shantari, I think recognizing what I have heard in the conversations is that in the past, council has evaluated expansions in this direction, and previously council has refused expansions in this direction. And the fact that we have expansions in this direction is because they were imposed by the former Ontario Municipal Board. And that as a very narrow path of general rural land, which reaches up towards the Ottawa River, there is a question about when does it end? And is it a logical area to keep on going? So with respect, I recommend you ask Councillor El-Shantari if he wishes to dispute what I said. He may have his own views of that. I'm just offering the concerns as I understand them.
And I know Councillor El-Shantari will wrap up and want to address that. So I appreciate that answer. The be it resolved portion of this motion does marry two different things. One is to remove these lands from the immediate inclusion into the urban boundary, and then the second part of it is to include it with the Category 3 lands. It could be to a new community option, or as Councillor El-Shantari said, it could be to a distributed or a focused option. These lands, I just want to make sure, they clearly score higher than anything that is in any of those Category 3 lands, right?
That is correct, Council.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Leeper. Councillor Kate.
Thank you, Chair. I just have one question that relates to the question I asked earlier about a timeline. If we remove these Category 1 lands, does it increase the timeline in which we'd see shovels in the ground for the other Category 1 lands or even the Category 2 lands?
So chairs, before this land could open up, we would need to undertake a secondary planning process. We'd need a master servicing study. We would need, again, tying it. I think there's some significant issues with this piece that the transportation master plan would have to address, because I think Councillor El-Shantari makes a fair point about everything relying on the March Road corridor. It's really a single corridor that attaches to the main spine system. So there are a number of issues. This parcel of land will require a lot of planning before it can come online. And you might note that land that's already approved in this area has not yet been built on. So there have been challenges in moving this direction. So I can never give a good projection on a timeline. I don't have a great crystal ball on this. There are other proposals of land in the urban expansion that we have before you today that I believe would come on faster than these lands. That's probably the best give Councillor Kitts with respect to the question.
I think my question is, I appreciate what you're saying, but if we remove these South March lands, would it increase the rapidity of which we would see other challenging Category 1 lands, such as Orleans South, which rely on a Brian Coburn extension that does not exist at the moment and is not in the affordable network and is estimated. So would it increase seeing those lands, like the rapidity by which we would see those lands be developed?
Chairs, I think it's really hard for us to give a projection. I think it's fair to say that the lands in Barrhaven and in Stittsville are the easiest of the proposals that we have before you to develop, and they would be most likely to come online fastest. I think that there's a middle category of South March and the Cumberland. I should say Cardinal Creek is in the easiest lands as well. I would say the Cumberland and the South March lands are in the middle ground of, there's a lot of complicated work that needs to get done. We need the TMP, we need other things to understand how this would work. And I would put them in the same space. And the Taiwan lands, depending on how quickly we get the information, would, you know, we've always identified will take a little longer because of the servicing work that we need to do and the challenges to bring that, because we do need to bring trunk servicing into this area in order for it to open up.
So if you're putting them in the same space, should there a consideration be made to move these other challenging lands elsewhere?
I mean, ultimately, as I said, the city doesn't control the exact dynamics of what happens fastest. If we have a very, very motivated proponent who puts their, you know, shoulder down to the grindstone and gets us everything we need and gets a planning process happening, things could happen more rapidly. It's just the list of technical issues is longer in some of these areas than others. And I really can't give the councillor an adequate answer to this question because we just don't control the process enough to know.
Okay, I appreciate the response. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one question for Mr. Willis on this. The go forward on this land, should we, like, how married are we to this as the block that we see before us? Is there an opportunity to change the shape of that? For example, there's lands that are close to the boundary in here that are probably easier to deal with than the whole package. Like Councillor Al-Shantiri has made a very good case as to why he wants to hold on the whole package. I'm just wondering, thinking openly here, is it a better idea to change the shape of this package to start moving pieces of it in the future?
So, Chair, staff recommended these lands come in. If council chooses that they don't come in, that's council's choice. If council wishes to cut back on the amount that comes in and take less than the full amount staff recommended, that's a choice that the council is able to make. So you know, Mr. Mark can correct me, but I believe you have the choice of taking Councillor Al-Shantiri's motion as presented, which removes it all, or someone could propose an alternative motion that would remove less of it, or you could adopt the staff's report, which would include it all as originally shown. I think those are your three options. Mr. Mark can correct me if I have not framed that properly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
So if there is no other speaker, I just want to wrap it up quickly. I do appreciate the time we've given to this. But folks, you heard from Mr. Willis, there's other area would be a lot easier to develop than developing around 5 or 6 existing country state lot subdivision. And they made up, there's 150 home and a total of 105 hectare has been designated for those country state law. And Councillor Leeper, to answer your question, once we go, you open that up, that area, Councillor, the remainder of the land between March Road and all the way to Woodlawn, basically to Vance Side Road, that's a general rural. That's not agriculture, so there's nothing to protect that land once you go that far. And what's that to the villages? What's going to happen to the village of Glen Robin? And that's the concern we have. But there's other land we know it's a lot easier to develop than this land. And I have to tell you, the cost of service in that area, and I know it's scored high, I understand why, because March Road, the transit, and also employment area in Canada North. But it doesn't, to that day, after 10 years, OMB grant Area 1 to that big developer in the city. We have not seen one house built there yet, and they're supposed to build 3,400 homes and 5 commercial mall in the Area 1. I spoke with my colleague, Councillor Studs, and I see her on my cover. I don't want to put words in her mouth. She's also in support of removing that land at this time. So with that, I'm looking for your support, and I hope I can get your support to move this land. And again, to be that joint plan agriculture. The first committee recommend that council approve that the South Marchland cluster identified in recommendation 3 be removed and the land supply 175.35 net hectare be added to the new community option in recommendation 5 of the staff's report as amended. So you're going to need A's and A's, Madam
Yep.
Chair, unless
Okay.
you want to speak.
No, Councillor Dudas? Councillor Dudas?
Sorry, yes.
Councillor Tierney?
Yes.
Councillor Leeper?
No.
Councillor Brockington?
No.
Councillor Kitts?
No.
Councillor Giroux?
Yes.
Councillor Moffat? Councillor Moffat? Councillor Meehan?
Yes.
Councillor Hubley?
Yes.
Vice Chair Gower?
Yes.
Chair El Shantiri?
Yes.
And myself, yes. That is 8-3.
One abs.
And, okay, thank you. The last motion that we have today, and I'm making another call just in case anyone has a motion that they haven't provided yet. Councillor Dudas, did your hand up for your directions?
For this motion, I had a question.
The Taiwan one?
Yes. that's
Okay, all right. So this is being moved by Councillor Tierney. These are the Taiwan Lands, the new official plan growth management report 2, lands proposed for residential and industrial urban expansion. As I said, Taiwan Lands. And Councillor Tierney, if you just have any comments first before I go to Councillor Dudas.
No, Madam Chair, I will save my comments for wrap up.
Okay, fine. Councillor Dudas. Anyone else have any questions? Please raise your hand.
Wonderful. I
And-
just had a question about the last further be it resolved, and this is to staff. Just in regards to, so some of the concerns that have been asked about the cost of servicing this land and the cost to the municipality. In the motion itself, it speaks to the potential for accessing funding potentially through the provincial or federal governments. And I was curious as to what that would mean if staff could elaborate what potential funding opportunities we would have if this land was approved.
Chairs, I hope you can hear me clearly. I'm having some technical issues. The intent of the motion is recognizing that we are talking about a partnership with an Indigenous community who is not traditionally a developer and would not necessarily have the same asset base that a developer would have, that we think is reasonable to go to the senior levels of government to ask them to support the Indigenous community with their effort to develop these lands. Otherwise, those costs are on them that then get transferred onto prospective future homeowners. So I think the intention here is a recognition that there are big infrastructure costs to open these lands up, and that we should at least put the question out there about whether the senior levels of government are prepared to support the project. The city would not want the city's asks for its own priorities to change. That we would see this as the government supporting the Algonquins of Ontario, not supporting the city of Ottawa.
And this land is adjacent to the Amazon fulfillment distribution center, whatever we call it, the Amazon facility. It's right next to all of that potential opportunity. This land in particular, I know that we had difficulty, staff had difficulties with assessing it, and that it is a bit of a leap of faith in some respects. But I'm also recognizing that there is potential opportunity, quite a lot of potential opportunity here with the being adjacent to Amazon. Can staff speak a little bit about how that facility could potentially connect to the development of this land? Not necessarily what the Algonquin peoples are proposing, but I'm just saying from a city perspective, how we could link the two.
And maybe remind us of the amount of land that's been added in the, I know it was only, I think it was only a small amount, but in the industrial motion that we moved yesterday? No, when did we vote on that? Yeah, yesterday.
So chairs, I'll ask Royce to give the numbers in a moment. I mean, I think the Algonquins of Ontario and their partners control a very vast area. We have to understand more about their phasing plan to understand kind of what would go link. They wouldn't be physically connected necessarily because there are intervening natural heritage features between the Amazon site and this. But, you know, if we are looking at economic synergies, wouldn't others? I think time will tell. I can't give the councillor a prediction on that. I think we need more planning work to understand.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate we're making large decisions and there'll be more staff input and resources put into this. You know, personally, I've heard some of my colleagues use the words compelling in regards to this proposal. I think, as I said, this is a bit of a leap of faith, but in terms of, once again, wading in reconciliation and looking at the opportunity that this could provide, I'm very much in favor of considering it. And I think that this is a good motion. So I will be supporting this motion. And thank you, Steve, for your input on this.
Is that it, Councillor Dudas?
Yes, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hubley, followed by Councillor Leeper, followed by Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a quick question for staff on this, and I don't know if it's going to be Mr. Willis or Mr. Mark on this, but what I want is some assurances here that the language of the motion will protect the city taxpayers on this one, that we're not going to be obligated to provide all the servicing and everything, that some sort of a legal and binding agreement can be made to protect the taxpayers here. Is this motion enough to do that?
Councillor, I think in chairs, I should say, you know, what staff asked council to do right now is tell us which area to focus in on, and we would develop a policy regime around whatever choice council made. There's a genesis for advice in this motion about things we should focus in on, and staff are listening to the comments being made by councillors in this debate. And I think ultimately the draft policies that should council adopt this, the draft policies that accompany this decision in the official plan will have to lay out a bit more detail. And I think staff will need to do more work on this. I mean, we couldn't go into this presuming council would make this decision, but we have, I think, as I said, the genesis of some of the issues identified in the report and in the motion.
Okay, so to confirm, there's nothing in here that puts us at risk at this point. There's still lots of work to be done before anything gets finalized. Is that correct?
Chairs, council will have several decision points along the way. There will be the draft official plan and the policies. There would be secondary plans, would be the as it relates to the infrastructure master plan and the transportation master plan. Any front-ending agreement that would come out of this, any additional work. So there'd be planning applications for years to come on this to implement it.
Okay, thank you very much for your candor, Mr. Willis. Much appreciated. That's it for me, Madam Chair.
Thanks very much, Councillor Hubley. I just have a question for the mover, Councillor Tierney. Councillor Tierney, in here in the last direct staff of the motion, direct staff that the remaining 270 hectares be added into the urban boundary. I'm taking that you would be, you would agree that the number should now be 445 after the last vote on the South Marchlands?
Based on Mr. Mark's comments, yes, I believe that would be correct, as well as the amending motion, friendly amendment by Glenn Gower will also be included as well.
Okay, so for everyone, maybe we could make that change. Okay, thank you, Councillor Hubley. Who else?
You asked my question, thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Councillor Teresa Kavanagh. Teresa?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm looking at the diagrams that have been sent, I think I share the concern about the costs, because staff have pointed out that that's the reason that they didn't choose this, in terms of making connections, especially water and sewage, et cetera. Is that in a development charge? How is that worked out exactly in terms of the way you make sure it's not costing the rest of the city, the taxpayers of the city, to develop this land?
So chairs, in the infrastructure master plan, what we would identify are the necessary trunk mains to distribute to the area and the pumping stations that are required. I think given this very exceptional situation, I mean, normally those would be covered in the citywide development charges, but because of the exceptional situation, we'd be looking at some sort of arrangement for an area specific charges to get to at least a portion, if not all of this, through that process. And the council's adopted fiscal framework has these costs covered through some form of development charges.
Okay, thank you. On the map, it shows natural features, rural features. Are we going to lose that? Are we, in terms of when this land is handed over, this is going to be completely developed? What framework do we put on to make sure that we keep a proportion of natural development or natural features?
Chairs, should council adopt this motion, the next step in my mind would be a more rigorous review of the natural features of the site, a much more detailed mapping, and those lands, like our official plan already says, would be excluded from development. And we would be looking at the lands that are not in those core natural heritage features and the buffers that we normally put around them. Those would be the features and buffers would be excluded from any development. We'd be looking at lands that are outside of that to accommodate this land need.
Okay, so what I'm seeing in that orangey color is expected to stay as natural features. I mean, once, obviously you have to re-examine it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, but these are a number of landowners. This is not like, because you've got the pink is the actual Algonquins of Ontario ownership. So how does that work?
So chairs, normally in an area, we have an example in the East Urban community right now where we're in the process of completing a secondary plan coming before council. The landowners get together in a landowners group that works with the city, and they coordinate each other and we work with them. And things like master servicing studies are paid for by the group. These types of additional technical studies are done by them. We expect the proponents to step forward and pay for these technical studies for us to do our work.
And in terms of transit, that was also a weak point, which concerns me. And how can that be accommodated? Is it related to the highway, or is it, how would, that's something that's a concern.
So chairs, this would be a matter that need to be studied further. What the proponents proposed in their brief submitted to us, and we have had confirmation from MTO, is that MTO would entertain, this is at a staff discussion, we expected a correspondence in writing, it may have already arrived and I haven't seen it yet, that the MTO would permit BRT facility or bus dedicated lanes on the 417 in that area to support the city's transit system. But that's, we would have to do a fair bit of work to understand that with MTO.
But we don't have that yet. So that would be a big factor, wouldn't it?
So Mr. Herwire can correct me. I believe that there have been verbal conversations with MTO staff on this, and they've expressed a willingness. I just, I have not seen paper in front of me yet, but it would certainly be a significant piece, but we expect that at any time.
Okay, anytime. So will we have that before council?
Just gonna ask Mr. Herwire, Don, have we seen it yet? I don't know if we've seen it yet. We will certainly.
We have not seen it yet.
Okay, so I think that would be very helpful in terms of making sure that this is, because transit is extremely important, and I just want to make sure that it's viable. since that is what part of what their, the proposal is. So I just want to make sure. Okay, all right, thank you. That's it.
Before we go to Councillor Leeper, can I just ask a question further to what Councillor Kavanaugh was asking? When we think about Zibi and it being Planet One type of community and all the costs associated with that, who's best? Is anybody here best? Maybe Mr. Herwire is best to speak to how that extra, because that's a lot of extra cost. And I know that the presentation that I had from Janet Stavinga was, and I think Lynn Kluche was there too, that it was that they were going to be paying for this and promising a Planet One. So since a lot of people have asked questions about the costing and stuff, I'm just wondering, what do we know about that? So what are our expectations? And if you don't know that before council, I think that's relevant info.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I think at this point it's very early. There is certainly a willingness to explore those options. Some of those preliminary thoughts, are problematic in terms of not contributing to citywide DC. So all that said, I think there's additional work on the the financial pieces that would have to come between now and June.
Yep. Well, thank you, because I think we were all given a copy of the presentation from the Algonquins of Ontario, and it said that they were not asking for a penny from the city, and that they are proposing to preserve, I think it was 50% of the lands which are rural natural feature. Yeah, just wondering about that.
They have been very clear that is part of their mandate, and they're in line with their One Planet objectives to preserve all the green space. So sorry, I can confirm that, is a stated objective.
And then also, I think it was 150 million towards transit.
Chair, that's correct. That in their proposal, they indicated that they would make an investment into the bringing transit infrastructure to the site. That's part of their proposal. Again, these are things we would work on with them should council pick this as the direction it wishes to go.
Okay, I mean, and in that presentation, they also had all of their transit going all the way back to Bowesville, I think. So if further to Councillor Kavanaugh was talking about, I think it was Councillor Kavanaugh about the province and the role that they could play. I think that the cost would be much less than that too if they were able to use the 417. But I think that Chair of Transportation Tim Tierney might have more information on that. Anyway, I just throw that into the mix because I'm paying attention and it interests me. Sorry for interrupting. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks, Chair. So I just want to make sure before we vote that, I've got a good grasp on the decision that we're making here. In total through 2046, can I just confirm that the total amount of net hectareage is supposed to be 1320?
I believe that's 1281 hectares is the amount.
Okay, 1281. So by making this 445, we're now looking at over 1/3 of the total expansion in the city on greenfields expected through 2046. A little over, or significantly over 35% or so would be tied up with the Taiwan proposal.
Yes, that's correct.
The other option that council has is to distribute those 1281 in multiple small parcels around the existing edge of the city. Are the majority of those proposed parcels, I think the vast majority of those proposed parcels, they're extensions of existing servicing, extensions of existing transit?
Yes, thank you for the question. I believe Mr. Willis spoke to this quite eloquently. Barrhaven, Finley Creek, and Stittsville lands are relatively simple, minor additions to existing infrastructure and services. The South March and the Orleans South lands were more complicated, further issues in terms of transit and so on. And the Cardinal Creek was also straightforward.
I'm interested. It was put to me earlier that the definition of sprawl is when you leap the pipe, and the only, as far as I can tell, and I just want to confirm that this is true, the only option of the three that actually leaps the pipe is this Taiwan option.
Councillor, I'm not clear on what you mean by leap the pipe.
So you're not hooking in to the existing sewer easily. You're bridging undeveloped land in order to hook up the services.
Councillor, maybe I'll answer this question. First of all, it's worth going back to understand that twice before, council has voted and directed staff to complete the existing communities and find ends to existing communities and then look at a new community. That was voted on in 2017 by council as part of the resolution OPA 180, and it was voted on last year in May as part of council's resolution. So I'm not disputing what the councillor is saying, that this would involve, it'd be very different than continuing to extend the existing communities as we've done in the past. It would be a significant change in what Ottawa has done since amalgamation. And it would be taking a pipe to a new area and opening it up. But I am just reflecting on the fact that that is consistent with what council has told us on 2 prior occasions to do.
It's a bigger leap at 445 than it was at 220. Okay, I'll be interested to hear what my colleagues have to say, but this is it's well worth considering very, very carefully.
Okay. Councillor Meehan, followed by Councillor Gower. Anyone else want to speak to this item before I go to Councillor Tierney? Councillor Meehan?
You're on mute.
Unmute.
Sorry, apologies. God, long day. I'm finding this more of a challenging issue to vote on today, specifically because of the cost. I wish that we had, a dollar figure attached to what this is going to cost us because of servicing and transit. But at the same time, I know it's this exciting development and it's a great chance to get things right. I just want to go on record as saying I would love to know what this is going to cost us down the road. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Councillor Gower, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I've already spoken about the risk, so I won't go into that again. 2 things I wanted to mention. One was a lot of the other decisions we've been making about which lands today are strictly on the lands. And I do think it's important that this group for the Taiwan lands actually does have a concept around it, which is different than I think most of the other properties. But I just wanted to comment on what Councillor Leeper raised around the number of hectares. I actually think in this case, having more hectares to seed a community with would give it a better chance of succeeding if we decide to go forward. 200 and some hectares is about the size of Blackburn Hamlet or Glen Cairn. Twice that, all of a sudden, is more space for schools. We do have 4 school boards, for example, in Ontario, for better or for worse. More chance to properly protect the natural areas or integrate natural areas around with the community. More chance for a greater variety of retail and employment. So having more hectares may actually be a more promising or a more encouraging thing in terms of seeding a proper new community that can, in some ways, is going to have to be self-sustaining if we want it to meet our goals around transportation and mobility. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. thank you for that. So I don't see.
Just before we go to Councillor Turney, are you going to wrap up then?
Yes, he is.
Okay, just
Your microphone, Chair.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, sorry about that. So we heard from my colleague Caroline Meehan about the cost, and I know today is not just about the cost, it's about the land, and I totally agree with the Vice Chair that he has to say. But Mr. Willis, you did say there are a committee for the full cost to service that land. Am I correct?
That's what we have it, right?
In their presentation, they made reference to it's going to be the contribution to the city over 150 million. Is that information is correct?
Chairs, that's the proposal they've made. It's part of their proposal.
Yeah.
You know, as I've indicated in previous remarks, the next step really is getting into more detailed analysis of the costs and working out the agreements. We are guided by the fiscal framework that Council has passed in the past, which says that these growth-related costs are the responsibility of the proponent.
All right, thank you, Steve. We go to the A's and
Over
A's.
Tim.
Over to Councillor Turner. Yes.
Well, great. Thank you very much, chairs, and thank you, joint committee members today. I think we've had a very great chat about this, and this is very exciting. Imagine creating a sustainable community from scratch. When do we ever have that opportunity? When you're trying to retrofit communities to make them more sustainable and add features, it's near impossible. We have a tremendous opportunity. It meets the 5 big moves. That's the direction we gave to staff. It meets the provincial policy statement. The proximity to the 417. These are all really important factors, as well as the connectivity. Laura even mentioned it. Amazon's right next door. We have a good opportunity based on the presentations they've provided us to be able to contribute to transit and to be able to make that connection to that actual warehouse facility. The other side of the connection, which is really interesting to me during all these discussions and presentations, is the ability to have our, what I call a ghost station, Searville Station, that has no bus stop, none. There's no bus that actually physically stops at Searville. That's a good entry point or connector for this village in the future. Look, I think, you know, when you hear the feds and the province are working together on this as well, and I'm trying to leave the most important part right to the end, is truth and reconciliation. Look, this is a real opportunity where we can put ourselves on the map. And while I know that there's certainly some questions, we want to get the details still hashed out in certain elements of it. And thank you, Councillor Gower, for adding on that friendly amendment. They're going to come back in June, and we need them to come back in June and give us the presentation. Look, there's some of us that haven't even seen the presentation. Many of us had the benefit of really digging into the weeds. The cost was one of the first questions, but there is no cost. They have to borne the cost themselves. We will see this all come to fruition, I hope, in June. And again, a very, very exciting project. Thank you very much, chairs and committee members today.
Thank you. Thank you for moving the motion. We'll have yeas and nays on the motion. Councillor Dudas?
Yes.
Councillor Tierney?
Yes.
Councillor Leeper?
No.
Councillor Brockington?
No.
Councillor Kitts?
Yes.
Councillor DeRuse?
Yes.
Councillor Moffat?
No.
Councillor Meehan?
Yes.
Councillor Hubley?
Yes.
Vice Chair Gower?
Yes.
Chair El Shantiri?
Yes.
And myself, yes. That's 9-3, I think.
Yeah. 3-9.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So where we are now is we are going to the directions from Councillor Dudas. We have 2 of those, and you've already introduced them, correct? You read them.
I have read them, yes.
Do you want or need to speak to them as the directions, or?
Well, I think I can speak to the Gold Belt one. It really speaks to what we heard from delegations yesterday. There's just a greater need for clarification about what it really will do and what it will entail and whose hands it ties and how it will function. So, once again, staff, we're going to be bringing back their policy directives in June. This just adds to that, gives the public, developers, residents, ourselves a little more of an understanding as to exactly what this will do to protect our agricultural lands, or aggregate lands, or natural resource lands, while still allowing us to provide the necessary infrastructure. So basically, this one is just putting a little bit more meat on the bone.
That sounds good. And your next one is the one on gating. Yes, the one on gating.
Yes. Yeah, so this one, I might put a little bit more context in for this one. This one is very, very specific to lack of infrastructure in the communities of Notre Dame des Champs, Bradley Estates, and the Greater Orleans communities. As my colleague Catherine Kitts said a little earlier ago, these are all areas that are particularly confined and constrained because of the lack of infrastructure. They're all bound by the Greenbelt, and they currently all funnel to the west and south, only using one road in it. And if they're not using that road, they're on rural roads that are not equipped to handle the traffic. And it's not just traffic, we're talking about the lack of transportation and transit, as well as active transportation. So the city has prioritized the need for Brian Colburn to be extended. That's also going to see that the Cumberland Transitway is built. But the city's preferred and only affordable option, option 7, is currently being opposed by another level of government. So meanwhile, we're still seeing development in these areas. It's happening at a rapid pace, and there's no short-term solution to the lack of infrastructure in sight. And in fact, a lot of these development applications are currently citing construction of the Cumberland Transitway and Brian Colburn as being imminent, which, sadly, it's not. So what this direction does is it asks staff to identify the specific gating, roadways, public transitways, and active transportation facilities that would be applicable for the approval of the South Orleans Category 1 lands, as well as the Category 2 Notre Dame des Champs lands, should those be recommended for inclusion within the urban boundary at any point. And instead of just building more residential and hoping that one day all this lacking infrastructure is going to catch up, this will mean that staff will identify what's needed, and we're going to start saving towards their construction before more shovels are put in the ground. So,
Thank you very much. Well said, and I can understand why you added the extra verbiage to that one, because you certainly are experiencing something in the East End. But really, like I said earlier, a lot of us are in our necks of the wood, but you've got a big development that's coming in there. I think it's about 290 hectares maybe. All right, thank you. I don't see any more speakers, so we are, I think, Mr. Mark, am I at back to the report now? Mr. Mark?
Yes, Chair.
Were you asleep? Were you asleep at the switch?
No, Chair, I just had to maximize Zoom if you really wanted to know.
Too much information. So what do I need to do with this motion? Can I just say, do I have to change item number 5 where we have the 3 choices? What do I need to do? Can I say on the report as amended?
Yes, you may, Chair.
Okay. So we will do that, okay? So everyone, you have a copy of the agenda and the report before us. So we're going to have yays and nays on the report as amended. Okay, Councillor Dudas.
yes.
Councillor Tierney.
Sorry, Chair, I intended dissent on one clause in that. Is that
Okay.
within the mechanism you're using?
Yes, well, it sure is if you tell me. So which one is it?
5.
Okay. Okay, so when I get to you, I'm going to make that exception, okay? Unless someone else wants to too. So on the report as amended with the exception of number 5, Councillor Leeper.
And myself.
And Councillor Brockington. Okay, we have that, Melody? All right, Councillor Kitts.
Sorry, yes.
Counselor DeRuse,
Yes.
Counselor Moffat,
No.
no on the whole report, or you're just on the same as the other ones?
No on the whole report. You lose agricultural land, you lose the intent of the report.
Okay, Counselor Meehan,
Yes.
Counselor Hubley,
Yes.
Vice Chair Gower,
Yes.
Chair El Shantiri,
Yes.
and myself, yes. So that is 9-1, and it's 11-3 if we remove number 5. Is that as clear as mud? Or no, it's 11-1 if we remove number 5. Correct, Councillor Brockington? Yes,
I'm only opposed to clause 5.
that's right. So that's what I just said, even in my convoluted kind of a way. All right, then. Thank you, everyone. I'll just make a quick check. As you heard earlier, I think it's the last week of June, we'll be back. Probably book the entire week. For the official plan in its entirety will be back before us. So lots of planning going into that and lots of work in between now and then. And I'm sure you're all up to the challenge. So so anyways, we're adjourned. Thanks very much for your attention. Thanks very much, Melody. Thanks very much, Mr. Willis, and your whole team. And thanks to all the people that came out and participated, and all the ones that have participated up to this point and will continue between now and at the end of June. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks especially to staff.
Thank you, Jan and Eli, for chairing.
Have a good night, everyone.